Hello and welcome back to the Dyslexic Linguist channel. Today we are talking about the autism industrial complex. If you did not see part 1, which is titled The Linguistics of Autism, you should go ahead and watch that video and click right off of this one, because this video is not going to make any sense if you don't watch that one. And it's pretty long. This video is also going to be pretty long. So if you're sitting there and you're going, well, I have some background on autism, I don't need to watch the first video. Yes, you do. You really do, because I talk about very specific linguistic aspects of autism that are really not discussed in more mainstream discussions of autism. Virtually every book that I've ever read about autism, Unmasking Autism, The Autism Matrix, and as we'll discuss, the Autism Industrial Complex, which I actually haven't read the entire book. I've read the paper and I've read parts of the book, but I haven't read the whole thing. But regardless, they really don't talk about the linguistic developmental parts of autism. And even if you do know a lot about autism, I talk a lot about linguistics that is going, and that kind of background information on linguistics is really what informs a lot of the philosophy behind this video. So that is necessary, that's required watching. And if I'm talking too slow in the video, you can put me on 2x speed, that's okay. I won't be offended by that. So if you did watch part 1, I guess we can go ahead and get started. We left off by talking about alternative augmentative communication, or I-ASC, which is what I'm going to be calling it for the rest of the video, and specifically how non-speaking autistic people use I-ASC. And before I can really get into the specifics of I-ASC, I'm going to talk about the autism industrial complex, specifically the ABA industry, because that is I don't even know what to say. The ABA industry shapes literally everything that has to do with autism. So it's really impossible to not talk about ABA when you're talking about non-speaking people. And as we'll get into, it is so deeply entrenched in our society. ABA is just it just defines absolutely everything. So we're going to be talking specifically about ABA a lot, and then we'll get further into I-ASC and what I mean when I say the autism industrial complex, because it really has a pretty specific definition. And I think ABA is a lot more, I guess, pervasive than you might expect. And for that reason, this video is going to be, I think, a lot more serious than my last video, part 1. My last video I was talking a lot about linguistics, a lot about, autism in general and language development. This is going to be a lot more serious because ABA is a really, really harmful entity. It's hard to imagine just the amount of harm that it's caused, and just how deeply it has hurt so many people for so long. For some people, like a majority of their lives are spent in ABA therapy. So if you don't know what ABA is, it's applied behavioral analysis, and if you don't know what that is totally okay. I will explain everything about it. But I think most people that are, more aware of the autistic community or are in the autistic community are very much aware of ABA. And it's surprising to people, myself included, when I first learned about it. And as I'll get into, I worked in ABA for a pretty short period of time. It's shocking just how bad it is, and it's one of those things where it's like you think, like, well, it can't possibly be that bad, and it's actually worse than you would ever, I feel like the more I learn about ABA, the more, like, just completely irredeemable it is. I don't think it's something that can be reformed. I don't think it's something that we should try to reform. And I think it can be replaced by something entirely different. And it doesn't have to be this way. So yeah, just a little warning up at the top that I'm going to be talking about some pretty difficult topics. Yeah, nothing really graphic, but it's going to be disturbing. Like, I'm going to be talking about some very disturbing things. So if you feel like you're not in a place to be deeply disturbed, then maybe watch this video at another time. I can't get this hair, dude. The other thing that I wanted to say before we start is that this is a one-woman show, you guys. It is all me. I am the one recording it. I'm the one that's going to edit this. And, you know, I go to university. I'm going into my senior year of my bachelor's degree, this coming fall semester. So for, like, in my last video, I talked a lot about linguistics and some very foundational linguistic theory. You know, I learned about that in my classes. I'm going to be talking a little bit about, like, a sociological perspective when it comes to the autism industrial complex. And so these kinds of, you know, sociological and linguistic perspectives, you know, I've gained these through, you know, taking classes over the last 3 years. But when it comes to any and all of the research that I'm talking about autism, the literature by non-speaking people, any of the books that I've read about autism, I mean, literally anything that has to do with autism, that comes from me reading about it. I did not learn about it in any of my classes, and the opinions I share are not reflective of my university or of my professors, and I didn't collaborate in any way with other people in the creation of this video or my previous video. Any of the people that I'm going to talk about, whether it be autistic people or researchers, or other people that you'll come to see are very relevant, I did not consult with any of those people. I don't know any of these people. They do not know me, and none of the people that I'm going to talk about in this video know that I'm making this video. And most of them have no idea who I am. So, yeah. So, let's actually get started then. So, I would like to begin by looking at a website called UnitedForCommunicationChoice.org. They have some really, really great resources that we're gonna look at a couple of different things on this website, but I want to get started by looking at their facts page. So I'm just gonna read through this a little bit, and then we can start really going into the specifics of everything. I'm gonna jump around a little bit when I do this. Individuals with disabilities who cannot speak due to various neurological and motor conditions, including autism, are the most vulnerable and isolated members of society. There are at least 3 million non-speakers in the United States alone. Many people wrongly assume people who cannot speak are incapable of complex thought and language. Now I'm going to go back to the top. A small committee within the American Speech Language Hearing Association, ASHA, proposed that the organization take steps to prevent some people with disabilities from accessing their preferred and only effective means of communication. On July 16, 2018, a coalition of 23 national nonprofit civil rights and disability advocacy organizations asked ASHA's board of directors to withdraw the flawed and dangerous proposals. In the wake of these threats to the human, civil, and legal rights of persons with disabilities, a coalition of individuals with disabilities, their families, and allies organized a grassroots campaign called United for Communication Choice. So, in my last video, I was really talking about the linguistic theory behind language development, right? And then I talked about language development in autistic children, and then I gave my opinion about how there are a lot of shortcomings with the current linguistic theories that we have, and also how the mainstream psychological perspective on autism really can't explain language development in autism either. So what I'm going to be talking about in this video is why that is. Why psychology and linguistics really can't explain language and autism. So in this video, I'm going to be talking more about the philosophy behind that mainstream psychological perspective. So next, I'm going to read an article written by Ido Kedar. Not totally sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Ido is a non-speaker. He is an author, and he's written, I believe, 2 books now. One was an autobiography, the other one was a novel. And so this article is from September 23rd, 2018. So the title is, "I was born unable to speak and a disputed treatment saved me." Subtext, "The rapid prompting method taught me to communicate, but speech pathologists disdain it." I have non-speaking autism, which means my ability to communicate verbally is limited to a few words and well-practiced short phrases. Thanks to apraxia, even that is mostly unintelligible, except to those who know me well. While no one demanded that Stephen Hawking rely only on his speech to prove his smarts, it's different with non-speaking autism. Because we are born trapped, we never had the chance to prove ourselves before losing the ability to speak. When I was a toddler, my parents were told I had receptive language processing disorder and possibly a cognitive disorder too. I was drilled endlessly at the most remedial level. This might have been okay if I actually had a language processing disorder and didn't understand basic concepts, but my disability is something else entirely. I have always understood speech. I have insight and I'm intelligent. I just couldn't demonstrate this in my drills because my body didn't enable me to speak or move the way I wished. So I spent a lonely childhood listening to specialists who misunderstood everything about me, unable to defend myself by communicating. My intact thoughts don't transmit reliably to my motor system. I want to speak, but I cannot. This has robbed me of my autonomy, imprisoning me within my own uncooperative body. To compound the problem, my autism comes with strong involuntary compulsions like waving my arms in excitement. My odd-looking movements only worsens the specialists' perceptions of me. The experts, who held such power over my young life, were always confident in their theories. Until I was 7, I had no means to disprove them or convey my thoughts at all. What liberated me was the rapid prompting method, or RPM. Through it, I learned how to move my arm to touch letters to communicate, first on a letterboard, then on a keyboard, then on a tablet with a voice output app. The process of learning how to control my unreliable hand for the purpose of expressing myself was gradual and painstaking, but it was worth it. Yet the professional organization of speech-language pathologists has denounced RPM. The American Speech-Language Hearing Association, or ASHA, claims RPM has not yet been validated by testing, asserting, quote, "There is no evidence that messages produced using RPM reflect the communication of the person with the disability," unquote, rather than that of the helper. Yet my partner merely helps me maintain my focus. I move my own arm untouched. The thoughts I express are my own. Many typers, myself included, have progressed steadily in skills, fluency, and independence over time. It's documented in films and evident by observation. We are not exceptions, but indications of what could be possible for many more suffering children. Slowly touching letters with one finger has transformed my life. With this skill, I escaped remedial education, became a general education student, and graduated high school with honors. I now take college classes. On my iPad, I've delivered speeches at universities and conferences. I've written 2 books about autism. My first, Ido in Autism Land, a memoir I wrote as a teenager, has been used in university classes. I released my second book, a novel called In Two Worlds, in July, shortly before ASHA released its position paper discrediting RPM. In Two Worlds takes the reader into the head and heart of Anthony, a non-speaking boy underestimated by everyone. Though his parents comply with all the recommended therapies, Anthony improves little and loses hope. At the age of 16, he learns to communicate by touching letters, but his family endures skepticism and opposition by the professional community. This book shows how confirmation bias is a huge problem in autism treatment. Asha's recent announcement has further validated this point. Speech therapy, which I received to no effect for more than 10 years, is Asha's endorsed path to communication. But if my family had relied only on that, no one would know I was even in here, intact under the quicksand of autism. Through letters, I became a free soul, not one limited to a few unclear spoken words. It would now serve Asha well to listen to the voice that RPM gave me. So, before we get into what RPM is, and before we get into ABA, I want to talk about what's called the mind blindness theory of autism, because I think that is a really huge underlying philosophy that really helped me understand the current state of autism research and treatment. The reason that I wanted to read Ido's op-ed is because he hits basically every point, starting with, talking about Stephen Hawking. Why was his alternative communication method respected, and why is Ido's not respected? And how is it that if this is true, if everything that Ido said is true, if Ido genuinely wrote this himself using I-ASC, why has this not completely changed everything about autism? Short answer is that, first of all, the autism industrial complex doesn't want that to happen because there's a lot of money to be made on the subjugation of non-speaking autistic people, but also because I think it will. I think in a lot of ways I think already it has changed many people's lives very deeply, but I think the widespread acceptance of RPM has yet to happen. I think it's something that will happen eventually, and it will probably happen sooner than later. And I'll talk about, exactly why I think that. So, this idea that non-speakers do not have receptive communication, that's what he was diagnosed with, receptive language processing disorder. And by receptive, it means your understanding of language. He was diagnosed with a disorder in his understanding of language. And the thing is that, in my first video, I talked about the equality of language and how it is not possible to have a sort of inferior understanding of language. This is not to say that people don't have language disorders, especially in people that have strokes. There is a very wide range of language disorders, and any kind of brain damage or brain trauma, these things really do exist. But the other, like I said in my first video, is that autistic people are not brain damaged. Autistic people do not have brains that look like they had a stroke, right? They do not have they're not just born with massive brain trauma, right? Even if they do have things like very low connectivity in the linguistic regions of the brain, that isn't evidence that they do not have any cognitive understanding of language and that they don't understand anything that's said to them, that they don't think linguistically. And so there's kind of this idea that it's almost like there's this whole class of people that are diagnosed with being born as not understanding language, as being born with alinguistic brains. Just for some background, in language disorders in people that have brain trauma, like from a stroke, there are specific disorders that they have, and they can be very, very widespread. For the most part, even if people that have what is called aphasia or an impaired ability to speak, even if they have completely lost the ability to speak, it's basically understood that they still understand speech, even if they can't express that. And that's usually what's assumed, is that they do understand. And the reason that assumption is made is because there are people that recover from strokes and brain trauma that cause language disorders, that after they recover, they can describe, well, for this period of time, I had issues with this aspect of language, and over time, their ability to gain it back. But when it comes to non-speaking autism, there's really an exceptionalism that goes on where even though there isn't any neurological evidence that autistic people just don't understand language at all, yes, it is common that there can be underconnectivity in the linguistic regions of the brain in non-speaking autistic brains, but that is not the case for all of them. They can have normal connectivity. They can have hyper connectivity. Like I said in my first video, with any kind of biological trait of autism, there's always a range. There's always a kind of a trend in certain things, but there's never one definitive thing that explains everything. Connectivity is one of those things. And so there's really no definitive biological or neurological evidence that non-speaking people do not have a capacity for language, or that they never developed language, that they never acquired language. That's not something that can be proven through neurological research. So the exceptionalism comes in with, then why are they assumed to not have any capacity for language? Why is it that for other people like Stephen Hawking, who had ALS, and as he lost a lot of his motor abilities, he also lost his ability to speak when he started using alternative communication methods. People believed that what he was saying through I-ASC was him. That wasn't really something that anyone ever questioned, but that is something that is very much questioned with people with autism. And even with people that go through language regression, that did for a portion of their lives, their very young lives, they were able to speak. For sometimes several years, they might have been able to speak and then lost the ability to speak. Even in those cases where there was a period of time where they could speak, if the results of that language regression is that they become totally non-speaking, they're still assumed to not have any capacity for language. And so when that happens, the parents of children who go through language regression that become non-speaking, what they are told is that that they are withdrawn, and that they're not told that, oh no, your child is still in there. It's just that their motor capabilities have changed, and that has also changed their physical ability to speak. It's still assumed that they do not have a capacity for language. It's not that they go, oh well, at first they were able to speak and now they're not. So like Stephen Hawking, who was at the beginning of his life able to speak and then lost his ability to speak. It's not like him where he still had a capacity for language. That assumption is not made with non-speaking autistic people, regardless of how they developed as into non-speakers. That's really the exceptionalism, right? Is this assumption, this baseline assumption of non-speakers do not understand language in any way, and they, let alone be able to communicate linguistically. So I think really what undergirds this assumption, I've seen it referred to as an assumption of competence, to assume that non-speaking people do have language capacity, but also that they are empathetic and that they are social and they enjoy being around other people, that kind of thing. They call that assuming an assumption of competence, where really the norm is the opposite, is an assumption of incompetence, an assumption that the language capacity in the brain isn't there, and not only that they don't have language, but that they're not empathetic, and that they don't enjoy being around other people, and that they just don't have the social connection that normal people have. So in my opinion, this comes from the mind blindness theory of autism. I don't think mind blindness was like a totally novel concept. I think it was kind of a like scientific explanation behind what was already perceived, what people already believed about autism. But what it did was it took scientific evidence to confirm these assumptions that autistic people are not empathetic, that they do not have, the normal social, they don't have like this, any of the kind of social aspects of what it really means to be human. What's crazy is that like now people, like if you Google mind blindness and like read about it, people will kind of say that like it's not really relevant anymore, but I think it very much is. I think the reason that people say it's not relevant anymore is because it's so obviously terrible that it's like you can't really justify like taking bits and pieces from the theory. So it's kind of denied that it's relevant, but I think it very much is relevant, and I will, when we get into ABA, I will explain specifically what I mean by that. So let's take a read, shall we? The mind blindness theory of autism. Thank you, Sir Simon Baron Cohen, for this monstrosity. So first let's define what old Simon means by mind blindness. So there's this thing called the Sally Ann test that was designed to show maturity in children, to test maturity in children. So the image depicts a little girl named Sally putting her doll into a basket and covering it up. And then she leaves. Then Anne takes the doll out of the basket and puts it in the box. The top of the basket and the top of the box are both covered, so you cannot see what's inside without removing the top. Sally comes back, and the question that is asked when performing the Sally Ann test is, where does Sally think the doll is? So the correct answer, as you probably guessed, is she's going to think it's still in the basket because she did not see Anne moving the doll, so she doesn't know that it's in the box, right? The way that very young children answer this question is, well, she's going to think the doll is in the box, because very young children aren't mature enough to understand that, to put themselves in her shoes and see that just because I know the doll isn't in the basket doesn't mean that she knows that, because she didn't see that. There's a few more steps of logic that your brain has to be mature enough to be able to take those steps. As children get older, eventually they're gonna answer it correctly, where when they're younger, they're going to probably answer it incorrectly. So the mind blindness theory of autism came out in 1995, and this was at a time where there was still a distinction between autism and Asperger's. So when I say autism, really I'm referring to people with limited speech capabilities or non-speakers, but mostly it's non-speakers, right? For the most part, when they say autistic, they mean non-speakers and not, the whole spectrum as we understand it now. And when I mean non-speakers, these are still people that usually have some kind of limited speech capability. So like Ido Kedar, he said that like he can say things, but it's usually totally unintelligible. These are autistic people that are definitely very limited speakers, but probably not as so limited to have their speech be totally unintelligible, because they need to be able to respond while they're taking the test. So these are mostly like more limited speakers, but not necessarily entirely non-speaking, as we would consider severe autism. And so I think the main reason that they would get this wrong was because like I've explained, their responses are not necessarily totally reliable. It's not necessarily what they totally meant to say. Another thing is that we'll talk about more later is that even non-speakers who are able to use I-ASC, there's still some variability in the reliability and what they're able to communicate. So if they are with a communication partner that they don't know very well, they might have trouble communicating with that person. These are questions that we don't really have the answer to why non-speakers are able to communicate or like kind of perform better depending on the circumstances. But I think it's pretty safe to say with these experiments, I-ASC was not used. So these answers would be based on the speech of people who are already unreliable speakers. I think this could be redone with people that do use I-ASC. I'll talk about that later, about the research implications of I-ASC. That's going to basically be the rest of this video, is the research implications of studying people that use I-ASC. The outcome at the time of this research was that, okay, all autistic people fail the Sally Ann test. Therefore, they have the maturity, the emotional maturity of a very young child. And so there are other things that you can kind of extrapolate from that idea of, if they don't have a certain level of emotional maturity that most adults have, from there you can go and say, well, maybe they lack empathy as well. They can't put themselves in the shoes of a little cartoon character, of like a 3-panel cartoon, and they can't understand this really, really basic concept of, like, the girl didn't see that the doll moved, and so how could she possibly know that it was moved? That means that maybe they don't understand anything about other people. And so that's where mind blindness comes from. So the way that they define, and this is primarily Simon Baron-Cohen, cousin to Sacha Baron Cohen, fun fact. First, he starts by claiming that humans are mind readers. And what he means by mind readers is essentially that we are able to read the state of mind of other people. So, as his example is, John walked into the bedroom, walked around, and walked out. To make sense of this, we ask ourselves why John behaved in this way. A mind reader might answer this question by saying something like this. Maybe John was looking for something he wanted to find, and he thought it was in the bedroom. Or a mind reader might think, maybe John heard something in the bedroom and wanted to know what had made the noise. Or, maybe John forgot where he was going. Maybe he really intended to go downstairs. These ideas of John was looking, he wanted to, he thought, John heard, he wanted to know, John forgot, he intended to. These are all, mental states. And anytime you make assumptions about what other people are thinking, generally speaking, that is mind reading. So mind blindness is an inability to read the mental states of other people. So if you take that to its logical conclusions that, okay, autistic people cannot understand the mental states of other people at all. If you take that to its logical conclusions, you get something really, really, really heinous. This is probably one of the worst things I've literally ever read in my entire life. So, like I said, this video is going to be a little bit more serious. This is one of those moments. Here's where you go with this mind blindness idea if you take it to its logical conclusions. The gulf between mind readers and the mind blind must be vast. Gopnik, 1993, gives a vivid account of her attempt to imagine just what the world must look like through the eyes of someone who is mind blind. Here's the example. This is what it's like to sit around the dinner table. At the top of my field of vision is a blurry edge of a nose. In front are waving hands. Around me, bags of skin are draped over chairs and stuffed into pieces of cloth. They shift and protrude in unexpected ways. 2 dark spots near the top of them swivel restlessly back and forth. A hole between the spots fills with food, and from it comes a stream of noises. Imagine that the noisy skin bags suddenly moved towards you, and their noises grew loud, and you had no idea why. No way of explaining them or predicting what they would do next. Tragically, mind blindness is not an idle thought experiment or a piece of science fiction. For some people, it is very real. Gopnik hints at how terrifying it would be to be mind blind. So, can you get more dehumanizing than that? Another thing about autism that I haven't really talked about quite a lot yet is like when it comes to like having more extreme sensory issues, there can also be things like that can really like change the way you behave. If every time you're around other people, they talk really loudly and you're really sensitive to sound, you might not want to be around other people that are talking because the sound is too overwhelming for you, right? And so if you observe a person that facially, doesn't have a lot of facial expressions, and verbally does not interact, and they avoid social interaction with other people, you take all of that kind of surface level observation of their actions, you can insert your assumptions of the reason that they do all of these things is because they don't like interacting socially. They don't understand what people are saying. They don't talk because they don't have any kind of internal ability to understand language. And that's all very surface level. It's all based on appearances. And it's a projection, right? It's a projection of a series of assumptions. So the scientific support that they have for this, a lot of it, like I said, is stuff like eye tracking. But it's like, okay, if when I'm having a conversation with someone and the person that I'm talking to is looking around the whole time and is avoiding eye contact with me, that could be because they're visually stimming. That could be because they really struggle to maintain eye contact. There's research that's shown that eye contact for autistic people can be really, really overwhelming and can be like a sensory kind of overload and even create like a fear response. But like, if you know anything about other cultures, or if you are from another culture that does not use eye contact the same way that Western culture uses eye contact, then you'll know that eye contact is cultural. Like, the expectation to maintain eye contact during a conversation is a social construct. In some cultures, it's rude to maintain eye contact. I know that's, like, for example, in the Navajo Nation, I'm pretty sure, I think in Japanese culture, it can be rude to maintain eye contact, like, depending on, like, your relationship to the other person. So, like, right off the bat, there's already this, like, culturally contingent expectation of autistic people that, like, because they fail making eye contact, all of these other assumptions of, like, they don't want to look at me, they aren't interested in talking to me, therefore they are not interested in socialization. Like, it's already, like, so many leaps and so many, like, just leaping to so many conclusions just with that notion alone. And that, in essence, is what mind blindness is just a series of leaps to conclusions that are very, very ill-informed. And then they're able to, like, use scientific evidence to show that, these differences are measurable and real. And it's like that there might be, like, cognitive differences that, like, between autistic people and non-autistic people, but that's not a confirmation that they are mind blind, right? This perspective, autism is a disease. It's a tragedy for a person to be autistic, and that warrants medical intervention. In general, there's this concept called medicalization, where essentially medicalization is where you take a trait or a condition that is not inherently, that does not need to be medically treated, but it is treated like it is a medical problem. Autism is one of these things where it is medicalized in the sense that the issues surrounding autism are social. We have constructs that make it so that autistic people are isolated. They struggle to function in our society. A lot of people struggle to function in our society, so it's not really something that's specific to autistic people. I don't think it's their fault. I think it's the way that we, I think it's our society in general that has a lot of issues. But when you take a social problem and you try to fix it with medicine or therapy, that is medicalization. Except autism can't be cured. So what happens is that autistic people are kind of supposed to be endlessly treated for something that will never improve. And that's where ABA comes in. And also the autism industrial complex. If you have something that can't actually be cured, but you can make a lot of money off of selling cures. So applied behavioral analysis is the only evidence-based treatment for autism. If you have a kid with autism and you take them to the doctor or the psychologist, they're going to tell you 100% of the time that your kid needs to be an ABA, especially if they are non-speaking or limited speakers. You will be told that it's the only thing that can help your kid. And not only that, but you need to start putting them in ABA as soon as possible in order to prevent the autism from getting any worse. So, like I said in my first video, when, like with the case of autistic regression, people have this idea that their child became autistic, that their kid was not born autistic, but something happened to them and then they became autistic, and that if they had done something differently, they could have prevented that from happening, and they kind of blame themselves, or they blame things like vaccines. But the reality is that when it comes to language development, the kid is going to develop the way that they're going to develop. Yes, they should be exposed to language, and like of course they need to be sufficiently exposed to language in order to develop it correctly. Parents should be talking with their kids. They shouldn't be using baby talk to talk to their kids. People should read to their kids. There should be a lot of linguistic interaction that goes into language acquisition. So what ABA does is it takes these fears that parents have that their kid is going to get worse, or that my kid's going to be like this forever, so maybe I can reverse that, maybe that can be reversed. So ABA is based on a psychological theory called behaviorism. I can't really get super deep into the definition of behaviorism, but essentially it really relies on this kind of like really oversimplistic idea that we, like, as not just as humans but like as like organisms, that we are very, very heavily influenced by our environment. Our behavior is shaped by our environment, such that like things that benefit us, if we perform behaviors that benefit us, that should lead us to forming habits and to continually do things that benefit us. And if you do something that impacts you negatively, that negative impact will cause you to do that behavior less or behave differently. And so the idea is that like that's how we learn, is that we learn based off of positive or like good things or bad things that happen to us. So as you're probably thinking, that doesn't really seem too super accurate. And so that idea, specifically the idea that our behavior is shaped by the good or bad things that happen to us, that's called operant conditioning. That is the foundation of ABA, is operant conditioning. So what we're gonna do is look at a paper called How Much Compliance is Too Much Compliance? How Much Compliance is Too Much Compliance? Is Long-Term ABA Therapy Abuse by Sandoval, Norton, and Schkedy. This was published July 2019. If you are like ambivalent about how you feel about ABA, if you're like an ABA liberal, you like don't feel like, you feel like ABA is something that can be like reformed and like it's not like inherently bad, I encourage you to read this paper because like I think it's completely bad. Pick circle. What happens if I don't pick circle? They have something called a prompting hierarchy. If they get it wrong, what you should do is look at the prompting hierarchy, which is basically a list of different prompts that go from least invasive to most invasive. Touch circle, and then you point at the circle. The therapist points at the circle. And so that would be a less invasive prompt. The most invasive prompt would be the therapist takes the kid's hand and has them physically touch the circle. That's called hand over hand. Another example would be like, say good morning, and the kid is supposed to just go, good morning. And if they don't say good morning, then the first prompt would be say good morning, and that would be the prompt is just saying the first sound of the first word. The next prompt would be say good morning, and then the kid is supposed to be prompted to say good morning based off of the second time they said good morning. And then the next prompt would be say good morning, and then they slide them a piece of paper that says good morning on it. And so on and so on. And so these are the kinds of prompts that it's like, oh, and then the other thing is that when they do get it correctly, you're supposed to reward them. That's like, you give them a toy, or you go, good job, buddy. And like, there's so many creepy videos that you can watch like on YouTube. I'm sorry to call these people creepy, but a lot of them are pretty creepy, where they take the kid. This is what they do a lot of the time. They take the kid and are like touch them, and I'm like, yay, good job, and like touch them and like, or like hug them, and like, which is like a lot, like, which is it's like automatically weird in general, but then it's also like, does the kid actually like that? Like, this is an autistic child, like they really like that? Like, I don't know. You can just search up ABA discrete trial examples. You'll see plenty of them. And the way ABA used to work is that it wasn't just a reinforcer. It's not just a reward that they would give them. They would also have punishments. And in the beginning, that used to mean electric shock. So that's kind of I can't get into the full history and origins of ABA, but it was pretty like draconian and like pretty overtly abusive. So the end goal of these kinds of drills, like you know, touch square, touch circle, is there's not actually any real utility to doing these things. Doing something like touch green, touch blue, touch cat, touch dog. You know, it's all flashcards, or it's like, you know, touch ball, touch race car, you know, something like that. It's not really, they call it teaching. They say that ABA is teaching, but what they're really doing is manipulating and training children into becoming more and more compliant. And that is the word that they use. They use the word compliant. How compliant was your client during session today? Sometimes they'll refer to the kids that they work with as students. For the most part, I think they refer to them as clients, because no one learns like this. No one No one learns like that. So the example that they give in the paper is like with potty training. Parents use operant conditioning with their kids to potty train them. So you know, if your kid uses the bathroom correctly, and you give them like an M&M or something, give them positive reinforcement as a reward, and eventually you wean them off of the conditioning, right? You keep doing it until they form the habit of going to the bathroom on their own. And so what ABA does is take this to the extreme. So, quoting the paper, while operant conditioning may be effective for teaching specific tasks in certain situations, in nearly all other circumstances, it is not typically used to the extreme extent that it has been applied for the treatment of many children with autism. And then they give the example of potty training and using operant conditioning for potty training. Conversely, many children with autism are taught the same task or skill for years using the same conditioning techniques, yet mastery is never met. ABA therapy has been viewed as the gold standard for treating children with autism because various meta-analyses have found it to be very effective. However, research indicates efficacy only with those who have a measurable intelligence quotient, IQ, typically at 70 or above. Many studies use IQ to measure efficacy or as an inclusion criterion, which means children who are nonverbal, particularly those deemed as lower functioning and untestable, are inherently excluded from these studies. Therefore, nearly all research on ABA efficacy excludes the nonverbal population. Yet, this is the population that tends to receive continual ABA services over a longer period of time, since they often do not meet the criteria needed for mastery of tasks for months or even years. So this is the core of the problem, is number one, these kinds of tasks, point at circle, point at square, point, touch car, touch ball, these are motor skills. These are tests of motor ability. Can you physically touch the thing I want you to touch? Can you say the thing that I want you to say? And so if you can't do those things, if you don't have the motor capabilities to do those things, then what in God's name is this therapy doing? What's going on? Why are you even in this therapy if you can't actually successfully do any of those things? And the kicker is that because those kids who can't ever really learn to fulfill these tasks because they have diagnosable apraxia or other motor skill issues, the way that they measure that in ABA is they go, okay, well they can't master the skill, so we just have to keep trying. Eventually they're gonna get it, but they're not. So what happens is that they do the same tasks over and over and over and over again for years. And so a lot of the kids that do ABA, they do it for years. And they do it for 40 hours a week, basically a full-time job. The other kicker is that this is the main clientele of ABA therapies. The main population of kids that go through ABA are limited or non-speaking. Like limited speakers, intermediate speakers to non-speaking. And these are the kids that if you are going to develop into an intermediate or non-speaker, that's not something that you can change through any kind of therapy. That is just the way that you developed. So trying to get someone who is physically incapable of speaking, trying to get them to speak, and then you try the same thing over and over and over again for years. I mean, sometimes up to a decade, you guys. Sometimes kids start ABA at as young as 2 years old, and then they don't stop until, for some people don't, they start doing ABA as adults. For the most part, it's kids that do ABA. So a lot of times not until they graduate high school that they stop doing ABA. So that could seriously be over a decade of ABA, 40 hours a week, doing tasks that you are physically incapable of actually performing correctly. So this sounds like hell, right? This sounds hellish. Okay, so let's go back to the paper. There have been limited, if any, scientifically validated studies on the use of ABA on nonverbal children with autism. Therefore, the most vulnerable children with autism cannot be tested and as such should not be candidates for such behavioral treatments. Why then is such intensive conditioning utilized on a population that would never be included in the studies that advocate for the usage of such behavioral treatments? Moreover, despite having produced a generation of nonverbal children who have undergone many years of ABA therapy, often well into adulthood, there is limited research on the status of these individuals, most notably their propensity for independence and whether ABA therapy has on the whole helped or hurt these individuals. So not only is this the main client of ABA, they are not researched. I don't know if you remember my last video how I mentioned that research on non-speaking people, because they have an IQ of under 50, because they're intellectually disabled, and because they can't communicate, which is why the reason that they were diagnosed as having low IQ is because they couldn't actually respond correctly to the IQ test, right? It's the same thing for ABA, where the whole structure of the therapy fundamentally doesn't work for the main clientele of the people that are supposed to use it. The reason that they're not researched, like I said in my previous video, is because it's seen as unethical to research them because they can't provide informed consent. But like they said in the paper, if you can't actually research these people, then why are they going through the therapy? If you can't research how the therapy affects them, then why are they still going through the therapy? Continue with the paper. Nonverbal children with autism are exposed to operant conditioning in all aspects of their lives until they are aged out at some time between age 18 and 21 years when services are no longer required by law. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act 2004. In fact, schools, ABA specialists, and researchers are learning that such intensive and chronic conditioning has instead amounted to compliance, low intrinsic motivation, and lack of independent functioning, the latter of which is the presumed goal of ABA therapy in the first place. Perhaps because ABA is considered effective in verbal children and in typical children for select tasks, the assumption that an even more intensive approach would be suitable for nonverbal and or lower functioning children with autism. Regardless, research has indicated numerous problems with the underlying theory of ABA, specifically unintended consequences such as prompt dependency, among other issues. While conditioning and prompting is initially meant to facilitate learning and help accommodate challenges related to autonomous functioning, the usage of prompting does not fade even when the need for it has. Prompting is used to compensate for challenges related to independent functioning and was intended as a temporary aid. However, research has consistently found that individuals respond to the prompts instead of the cues that are expected to evoke a target behavior, ultimately contributing to a learned helplessness and arguably to low self-esteem. This may also explain why intensive conditioning in nonverbal children rarely generalizes to other tasks, assuming that the target task is even mastered. Regrettably, the damage done by ABA therapy through this kind of intensive conditioning goes beyond adult reliance and learned helplessness. There is little evidence of prompts fading in order to decrease dependence and encourage students to respond to other people and more naturally occurring cues. In one particular study, dependence was even observed on playgrounds when a child could clearly engage with a task or play autonomously, but hesitated when a paraprofessional was near. The proximity, constant prompting, and intensive conditioning has produced various issues that proponents of ABA therapy and child advocates in general have failed to study. Research has indicated many problems with the premises behind ABA therapy and various similar interventions, yet longitudinal research examining the lives of adults who have been suggested to such conditioning since childhood is few and far between. Research has also indicated the psychological impact of the external reward systems and the impact of produced compliance. Detrimental effects are noted after the introduction of a reward, such as reduced motivation, reduced intrinsic interest, and reduced performance quality in both typical and non-typical children. The reward expectation even lingers after changing the target task and the environment, indicating that the only thing that is being generalized is low motivation and the need for rewards. One small study even found evidence of increased post-traumatic stress symptoms in those exposed to ABA. So they go on to say that research has shown that even in kids or adults who are high functioning that were put into ABA as children that at the time were diagnosed as having Asperger's also have similar consequences of prompt dependency and low motivation. Another thing that they go on to say is how this creates a learned helplessness. Shockingly, there is a lack of research that describes the many years of relentless conditioning of nonverbal children who cannot defend or express themselves. These children are forced to endure this kind of conditioning until a therapist or school district decides that the child is incapable of learning and abandons all attempts at teaching. But where are these adults now? What have they learned? Where is the longitudinal research? And so the other thing is that not only is there no actual research behind whether or not this works for the vast majority of the non-speaking children that are put into it, and this is really hard to talk about, is the way that they're actually treated by their therapist can be really, really, really bad. So one of the main things is that kids will be physically restrained when they're stimming or if they have some kind of meltdown. And I have seen that with my own two eyes. This really happens still to this day. A lifetime of prompt dependence can create adult-reliant children and robs them of the opportunity and potential for learning and growth. Interventions that result in years spent trying to force a child to engage in eye contact, condition a child to stop stimming, or obey commands such as hands down, with no apparent understanding of the function of such behaviors for children with autism, is undoubtedly abusive and frankly irresponsible when understanding the autistic brain. And they go on to say, like what I said before, that eye contact can be overstimulating. This overstimulation is seen in the overactivation of the amygdala when eye gaze is held for longer. Research also describes the function of stimming in children with autism similar to that of nail biting, playing with hair, tapping one's leg, etc. Yet these interventions have noted differences in stimming or movement and made arbitrary distinctions between which movements are pathological and which movements are not. Additionally, many stimming movements or behaviors have been shown to be related to stress and anxiety, which can cause unusual sensations and movements to escalate, while others are related to painful sensory hyperactivity. A lifetime of being punished for certain movements and being forced to engage in eye contact despite the physiological pain and discomfort of doing so is psychological and physical abuse. So where's the evidence, right? Why is this called the most evidence-based therapy or the most evidence-based intervention or treatment for children with autism? The reason is that the children that they do study that go through ABA are the high-functioning kids, are the highly fluent speakers, right? Or the more fluent speakers. These are kids with higher IQs, average or above average IQs. And when they're put into ABA, basically the way that I understand it is that a lot of the time they are supposed to be learning relatively more basic things. So one of the aspects of ABA is that they use different teaching techniques. So that is they call it task chaining or reverse chaining, where it's basically all they do is break down a task and then teach the task in a certain way. So when my dad taught me how to tie my shoes, he basically did that, where he broke down exactly the steps to tying the shoes. And at first I really struggled with it, and then he changed the way that he was teaching it to me a few different times, and then eventually I learned it. And so for when it's these higher functioning kids that go into ABA, I've also seen people, like, literally the only positive accounts I've seen of, like, adults that, like, or young adults that were children that went through ABA are exclusively from very high speaking people, very fluent speakers. And the one example that I've seen was a woman talking about, like, she might have been a teenager, but, like, a young woman talking about how she had self-injurious behaviors, and her therapists helped her, like, stop doing them. And so it's like, you know, that's great, but I don't think that necessarily had to have been achieved through ABA, number one. Number two, if you're having some kind of issue and you have a lot of people, and you have several people that are, like, trained professionals that are getting paid to spend time with you, that are focusing solely on you, that's going to be, like, a lot more support than you probably had before. You know, you're working with people that know that have worked with children with autism before, so it might be a very different experience from, you know, parents that just don't really know what they're doing when they're dealing with something like their kid having self-injurious behaviors. And so it's like, you know, sure, like, I believe that particular individual did have, you know, a very positive experience with ABA, but that's just not the way that it looks for most people. And so another thing is that, like, there has been data to show that, like, kids who are put in ABA can have an increase in, like, their speech capabilities. And I think it's kind of the same thing of, like, okay, if a kid is struggling with speaking, and then they have a couple of people sit with them every single day and, like, take the time to encourage them to speak in a way that their parents might not have the time or capability to do, I think that could absolutely be beneficial. I don't think it's the operant conditioning that's making that happen, number one. The other thing is that in those cases where kids do improve, like, significantly in their speech abilities, I think they always had the capability of doing so, right? Where for the kids that go through years and years and years of ABA and their speech never improves, it's because they never actually had the capability of speaking. So I think that, like, all kids should have that extra exposure to speech if they're having any kind of, like, developmental difficulties with language. But if they do become fluent speakers, that means that they always had the capacity to become fluent. It does not mean that that specific therapy gave them that developmental capacity to do so. That's their brain, right? That is the way that their brain developed. It's not something that can be taught, and especially not through ABA. And so these are the kids whose the results of their therapy, of their time in ABA, they are the ones that get measured, and they are the people that prove that ABA works. It's not the majority of the kids that go through ABA who do not ever learn to speak, who do not ever master the skills that they're supposed to master. So I'm going to read another article by Ido Kedar, and you can find this on his blog, idoandautismland.com. The title is A Challenge to Autism Professionals from February 16th, 2014. The theories regarding autism have been based on observation of our odd behaviors. List of these behaviors make a diagnosis. I have limited independence in self-care. I have limited eye contact. I have flat affect often. I can't express my ideas verbally. I have poor fine motor control. I have impaired initiation. I have impaired gross motor control. I have difficulty controlling intense emotions. I have impulse control challenges and self-stimulatory behavior. Oof. When I write that, it sounds pretty bad, but I function adequately in this world. I'm 17 now, and I am a full-time high school student in a general education program. I am in honors chemistry, honors U.S. history, and honors English. I am in algebra 2, Spanish, and animal sciences. I get straight A's. I work with a trainer 2 or 3 times a week to get fit. I study piano. I hike, cook, and help take care of a horse. I am invited to speak at universities and autism agencies. I am the author of Ido in Autism Land and a blogger as well. I have friends. I say this not to brag, but to let you know that people like me with severe autism who act weirdly and can't speak are not less human, as Dr. Lovaas suggested, and are not doomed to lives of rudimentary information and bored isolation. Dr. Lovaas, I believe, is the creator of ABA. I communicate by typing on an iPad with an app that has both word prediction and voice output. I also communicate by using good old-fashioned letterboard pointing. If I had not been taught to point to letters or type without tactile support, many people would have never realized that my mind was intact. My childhood was not easy because I had no means to communicate at all, despite my 40 hours a week of intensive ABA therapy. I pointed to flashcards and touched my nose, but I had no means to convey that I thought deeply, understood everything, but was locked internally. Meticulously collected data showed my incorrect answers to flashcard drills, but the limitations of theory are in the interpretations. My mistakes were proof to my instructors of my lack of comprehension or intelligence, so we did the same boring baby lessons year after boring year. How I dreamed of being able to communicate the truth then to my instructors and to my family too, but I had no way to express my ideas. All they gave me was the ability to request foods and basic needs. Here's what I would have told them if I could have when I was small. My body isn't under my mind's complete control. I know the right answer to these thrilling flashcards. Unfortunately, my hand isn't fully under my control either. My body is often ignoring my thoughts. I look at my flashcards. You ask me to touch tree, for example, and though I can clearly differentiate between tree, house, boy, and whatever cards you have arrayed, my hand doesn't consistently obey me. My mind is screaming, don't touch house. It goes to house. Your notes say, Ido is frustrated in session today. Yes, frustration often occurs when you can't show your intelligence and neurological forces impede your communication between mind and body, and experts then conclude that you are not cognitively processing human speech. So that's what's really happening. I mean, can you imagine that? Can you imagine that for 2 seconds, having to deal with that, for having to do 40 hours of that just for 1 week? Can you imagine doing that for a decade? Can you imagine your entire childhood, instead of going outside after school every day, you have to do ABA? And that's the reality for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of limited speaking and non-speaking children with autism, is that their only option is to go through ABA, because ABA effectively has a monopoly on autism treatment. I don't think it's the ADA, but it's like a Disability Education Act, and it might be the EIEIO, that basically the policy is public schools get a certain amount of funding to accommodate disabled children, but funding also goes to ABA agencies, where basically for free, parents can put their kids into full-time ABA instead of having them go to school, because a lot of the time, public school is extremely hard for these kids to, exist in at all, let alone succeed in, which I think a lot of kids really struggle to learn in the public school environment. I know that I did. I was in public school my entire life, and I hated it. And so shifting into the autism industrial complex, if you just look at it from the surface, if you just read how much compliance is too much compliance, what you'll see is there's the insurance companies and the ABA agencies, and then there's the BCAB, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. So ABA agencies, insurance companies, and the BACB. But it actually is so much more than that. So if you have a kid with autism and they are really struggling in public school, You can take them out of school completely and just put them in ABA. A lot of the time parents will have them in both, where they go to school and then they do ABA after school, or they go to, like, they have a half day at school and then the other half of the day they do ABA. And they really don't have any other options. So if you have a lot of money, you might be able to send your kid to an extraordinarily exclusive and expensive private special education school, but that's not most people. Like 99% of people can't afford that. And the only thing that their insurance will actually cover is ABA. And sometimes, kids will get expelled from their schools because their behavior. So sometimes ABA is really their only option. And so the BACB, they are the people that certify all of the people in ABA. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience in ABA. I was not a kid that received ABA services, but very briefly, I did work for an ABA agency. I actually worked for 2 different companies that did ABA. The first company I worked for was a very small business. I also did equine therapy, which is like horse therapy. The company was like half ABA. It was like a really, really small business. So it was half ABA, half equine therapy. And when I applied for the job, I wanted to work with kids. Because basically, like, if you can imagine, like, basically there was like a really small classroom, and then the rest of the property was like a horse farm. So when I first started working there, I did the training to work with the kids, and I spent less than a week in that tiny little classroom with very little air conditioning in the middle of Arizona summer, and it was horrible. It was about less than 10 kids, more than 5, less than 10 kids, all younger than preteen age. Maybe 1 or 2 was older than that, but I think they were all younger than preteen age. Most of them were either limited speakers or completely non-speaking. And what I saw was my 2 coworkers, who were like extremely overworked, because that amount of kids for 2 people is kind of crazy. And one of my coworkers was my age, so it wasn't like 2 like experienced adults in special education that were working with 8 children all at once. It was like 1 person that had experience in special education and 1 19-year-old. There was 1 kid who would stim a lot, and one of the main ways he would stim would be by hitting the table or by vocally stimming pretty loudly. And what they would do was tell him to stop. If he was banging on the table, they would hold his hands down to the table. When they would try to get him to stop stimming, he would just like instantly have a meltdown and like fall out of the chair onto the floor. Sometimes they would like bring him into another room and they would just let him like scream and cry until he stopped. It was overstimulating for me just to be in this room. It's hot as hell. It's tiny. The chairs are made for toddlers. I mean, like, and this was like a relatively big kid. He was one of the older ones, so it was like so many things were so wrong with the environment. And the reactions to him stimming was so horrible that I decided to not work in the classroom with the kids because I could not handle it emotionally. And I did not want to be complicit in that really horrible behavior by people that would have to be my coworkers, and like that I would have to like I couldn't push back against them because they had more experience than me, and like they basically did what our boss wanted them to do. So like a lot of the time, like the owner of the company would like be in the room, and like she would see that happening, and like she wouldn't stop it. Like before the owner like had more employees, like she would do those things herself. And so I worked for that company actually for like 6 months, but the rest of the time I just worked with the horses that were on the property. And then last summer I worked for one of the largest ABA agencies in the country. I worked there for 3 months. And basically my experience was I never met a single person that was in management in person. I only ever met my manager over Zoom, even though she actually lived in the same city as me. I don't know why we never met in person. And so the thing is that if you go to the BACB website, what you're gonna see is this like hypothetical hierarchy of like management. So on the lowest level, you have the behavioral technician. And so this is really the only person that is guaranteed to work one-on-one with the kids, is the behavioral technician, or BT. A registered behavioral technician is the laws depend on the state, but basically like you have to work for as a BT for a few months, and then you do like 40 hours of online training, and then you have to take an exam, and then you are a registered behavioral technician, RBT. For that, all you need is a high school diploma. You need a high school diploma, a tuberculosis test, and a clean background check. That's all you need. That's all you need to start working directly with kids for several months, okay? Before you actually have to get registered. Above them is the BCBA, who is essentially your manager, board certified behavioral analyst. What's supposed to happen is that your BCBA is supposed to basically give you like all of the like materials that you're going to use when you're working with kids. So like basically like the lesson plans, they're basically supposed to like create all of the lesson plans for you, like, and you have them beforehand, and then when you go into session with your clients, it's really just the BT that's working with the kid. My BCBA never gave me anything like that. So what was happening was like I was like basically supposed to do extra work that I wasn't being paid for, number one, but number two, I was doing work that I was not qualified to do. So I was kind of creating plans that no one gave to me, that no one actually like specifically helped me create, that I had no idea what I was doing. And like I was just supposed to go with that and figure it out, but like that's not how it's supposed to work. How it's supposed to work is that your BCBA does everything for you. Above your BCBA, you have another manager, and above them, there's another manager. And so, like, really, it's supposed to be like a team of people working just on one kid, working with the BT just to work with one kid. In reality, in my experience, it's just the frickin' BT that has no goddamn idea what they're doing at all. Working one-on-one with kids with special needs. It's crazy. And if I hadn't done it myself, working for one of the biggest ABA agencies in the country, I don't know if I would have ever actually believed it. It wasn't until I had these experiences myself that I really was able to understand that, like, ABA really is that bad. And so not only is it, like, people that are simply unqualified to be working with these kids one-on-one, but you can get away with a lot of crazy stuff, like physically restraining a child. And like, you know, when you're being trained, they say that, well, there should be, if your manager's not there, if your BCBA isn't there, then there should always be a parent either in the room or right outside of the room. Usually it's expected that they'll be right outside, that they're listening to everything that's going on the whole like 3 hours that you're having the session. And it's like, no, like that's not happening. The parent has to be in the house with you. They have to be there, but they're not going to be in the room with you. I mean, these people have jobs. A lot of the time they have multiple kids, a lot of the time multiple kids with special needs. So like the expectation that they're going to be sitting there for 3 hours like listening in is crazy. And so there's just like no accountability for what goes on at all. Like there is no, the kid that you're working with has literally like no way to hold the things that you do accountable as a BT. And so to be a BCBA, you're supposed to like, okay, well, before being a BCBA, you're a BCABA, which is a board certified assistant behavior analysis. And so all you need is a bachelor's degree in literally anything. You can have a bachelor's in literally anything, and you can become a BCABA. And then to become a BCBA, you should be getting a graduate level degree, so master's or PhD, usually a master's. And so in none of this training are you ever actually going to specifically learn anything about the traits of autism. All you'll actually learn is literally just the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. That's like super over general and like not good. So you basically just go into it knowing literally nothing about autism. And there's actually this one time during like a like training meeting that I was in, like a Zoom meeting. I'd never met any of these people in person, where like the lady like asked a question that was like, she was like, what's like, give me an example of like a skill that you want to practice with your client. And so knowing that this wasn't a very good answer, I unmuted myself on Zoom and went, making eye contact. And she went, well, that's not really, maybe I'm looking for something else. And then she moved on. And so the reason that, you know, that my answer was wrong was because it is now understood that it is unethical to force autistic children to make eye contact with you. She did not explain that. She did not specifically correct me on why my answer was wrong. She just said that's not really what I was looking for. And so that's kind of what I mean by like, even when there are like learning opportunities to teach like the BTs about autism, they're just not going to do it, even if they know like the answer, or like even if they are knowledgeable about autism, does not mean that they're actually going to try to educate the people under them about autism. So yeah, so I only worked for that company for 3 months. The first like month was basically like, I don't know, the first few weeks was just training, and eventually the kid that I was working with moved. In my experience, the child that I worked with had like really, really specific issues that were very obvious traits of a separate diagnosis from autism. I think the kid that I was working with had a comorbid condition that was undiagnosed, and I told my manager that. Not only did I tell her that, but I wrote down like 3 pages of notes on all of the reasons that I thought this. And I talked to her. Eventually I like got her to meet with me, and like by me, like when I say like I got her to meet with me, like I mean like it took a while for her to even meet with me to discuss this. We talked on the phone for like an hour, and she was all like, yeah, like this is a thing that we need to talk to with the mom. And so like weeks go by, and I'm like, I don't think, and because it's policy that there are specific things that I'm supposed to say to the parents, and there are specific things that I can't talk to the parents about. So it's like, I can't talk to them about personal stuff. I can't talk to the parents about like the lesson plans. I can't talk to them about the scheduling. I can't talk to them about so many things. But your managers are like, if they even exist, are like super unresponsive and really, really slow. So like I was constantly put in these positions where the parent would like rightfully want to have more information on what I was doing with their child, and I wouldn't be able to give it to them. Number one, because I wasn't supposed to, but also because I just like didn't know. Like I just didn't have an answer and so like for scheduling, that was just a pain, like such a pain. And like it was a whole bureaucracy where it's like, if something has to change with the schedule, you have to go through scheduling, and like no one ever wants to do their jobs. So it's like basically everything gets put onto the BT, and it's just a really bad position to be in, because like I said, like the BT is the only person that's actually in the home with the kid. That is the only person that is actually going to interact with the child. Everyone else on their team probably doesn't even know that a kid, probably doesn't know anything about that kid, right? Let alone ever actually been in the room with that child. So, like, my managers that were supposed to be above my BCBA, like, literally just didn't exist. Like, it was just like a blank part in the email of like everyone on your team, and then it was like one person. So, and like the other spots were empty. Like, it was really crazy. When it came to this like undiagnosed issue, like weeks go by where like I asked my manager, did you talk to the parents? She'd say, no, I'm going to do that this week. I'm going to talk to them this week. And then I would be like, I don't know if she actually talked to the parents or not. So, but I can't ask the parents myself, right? I can't do that because it's against the policy. So eventually, the kid that I was working with was moving, and like their family was moving. So I went against the policy. I asked the mom, did my manager talk to you about anything in particular recently? And then the parent says, no, your manager has not spoken to me in months. And I was like, okay. So I took the leap and I asked the parent. The kid was not in the room. This was after the session was over. I stayed overtime, not getting paid to be there to talk to the parent. And I say to the parent, do you think it's possible that your kid has this condition? Because I see this trait and this trait and this trait that all point me in that direction, and it's something that affects us every single session. Sometimes it takes up the entire session. It takes up the entire 3 hours. So what do you think? And I don't know whatever happened with that. The parent was like iffy about it, and like clearly didn't really have a very good understanding of what that condition was, which is like, that's normal because these parents aren't supposed to be psychologists. It's their team that's supposed to be working with them. But my team didn't do that. My team barely existed in the first place. So when you're a BT, number one, you have to do extra work that you're not going to get paid for. Number two, that work that you're not getting paid for, you are not qualified to do. Number three, you have to work with this horrible bureaucracy that's extremely slow and extremely incompetent. Number four, that kid that you're working with might have some really serious issues that you can't do anything about because no one actually wants to do their job to actually help that kid. So it's layer after layer after layer of craziness. How is it legal, right? Not only, and not even to mention the fact that the kid that you're working with has no accountability to you. You could be forcing their hands down every single time they want to stim. You could be rude to the kid every single day and treat them like crap, and there would be no accountability. And not only that, but the actual therapy that you're doing, chances are, fundamentally does not work for the kid that you're working with. Fundamentally does not work. So, at the very core, even if you have every single manager, even if the bureaucracy is well-oiled and functioning the way it was intended to function, even if everything is as good as it could possibly be, at the core it's still rotten. At the core it's still operant conditioning. At the core it's still behaviorism. And you can't actually measure the efficacy of what you're doing with the kids that you work with, which is really ironic because like basically everything that you're trained to do is to record data. So like how many prompts did I have to give for this one question? How long did it take for them to get it right? What was their behavior? What was their, and basically at the end of every single session that you have with the kid that you're working with, they go off and do their own thing. They're all done. But for the last 15 minutes, you have to take all of your notes. So it's like all the data that you took earlier in the session, you have that like on a piece of paper or something. You have that written down somewhere else, and then you put that all into your like closing notes. And then at the very end of the notes, you have to describe the compliance level. How compliant was the kid that you worked with? Did they listen to you the first time? Did they sit still? How easily could you manipulate that kid is basically the question of how compliant they were. Before I get further into like the full extent, like the system of ABA within the autism industrial complex, I want to talk about a specific part of ABA therapy, which is teaching language. So if you remember from part 1, the Linguistics of Autism, you'll remember me saying that language is not learned, it's acquired. The only way you learn a language is when you are learning a second language, is when you are consciously learning the grammar, the rules of another language. In childhood, you do not learn language, you acquire language. Noam Chomsky, I'm paraphrasing, but Noam Chomsky said that children do not actively acquire language. They do not learn language. It's not something that they do. It's something that happens to them. It happens. It's not their choice. It's not their decision. It happens to them. And that's the kind of biological foundation of language, is that biological language acquisition faculty that we have in our brains, that is innatism, and that comes from the critical period hypothesis. And even though like I explained how I think the critical period hypothesis is really limited, I think in general it's like the language, that the one single language pathology that they describe is correct for a majority of children, but not for a lot of autistic children. That was the biggest issue that I had with it. But I think that, this idea that language is biological and that it's innate, I do agree with that. And so I think it's the same thing for autistic kids. They do not have to be explicitly taught the rules of their native language the way that you would have to explicitly teach someone the rules of a second language or a non-native language. And so that's a distinction that linguists always make, is that, no, you're not teaching language. Kids aren't taught language, they acquire language. They're not learning language, they're acquiring it. It's a subconscious part of their development, is this acquisition of language. When they're learning the syntax, the semantics, the morphology, and the lexicon, these are not things that are explicitly taught to them a majority of the time. There was a pretty famous experiment that showed that kids learn words from the context. So when kids are learning words, it's not like, this is a pen. This is a pen. I write with a pen. Pen, P-E-N. Hey kid, this is a pen. It's not like that. What it's really like is, I'm gonna write with my pen, but you can write with the pencil. And so from there, the child is able, through syntactic inferences, which is called syntactic bootstrapping, they learn from the context. Okay, I know Hope is writing. I know that Hope is holding something, and I know that Hope is calling that a pen. So this is a pen. And that I know that this is a pencil because, because I said you can write with a pencil, and Hope is giving me the thing, and she calls that a pencil. So that's really, and that's really simple, but like that is how kids learn words, and that's basically how they learn syntax and stuff too, is that it's like, it's through the experience of interacting with the adults and the other, especially older children around them, that they just learn through the experience what words mean, and like the syntax, like the way that kids acquire syntax, like is also not totally understood, because it's like it just happens so quickly. And so it's like, yeah, kids will be taught like subject and predicate, and they'll be taught like, possessive apostrophe s and what it means to have a run-on sentence. It doesn't, but they already know, by the time they're learning those things, they already know just automatically. They already understand how to say a complete sentence that has a subject and predicate. They know how to use apostrophe s. They know how to use these aspects of grammar that are explicitly taught to them before it's explicitly taught to them. They know it intrinsically. They might not have the exact grammar terms. They know how to use them already. They know how to use these features of grammar already. So in ABA, when they claim to teach language, that doesn't make any sense. That is not how language acquisition works, right? Kids do not have to be explicitly taught language. And so what you'll see in a lot of if you read things written by people who went through ABA as children, they will say that the ABA people that they worked with not only assumed that they didn't have a complex language, but what people do is that they exclude functional aspects of grammar. Instead of saying touch your nose, they'll just say touch nose, or touch car instead of saying touch the car. Number one, it's an assumption. There's this assumption being made that these kids are gonna understand an inferior form of language that has oversimplified syntax. Not really sure where that comes from, where the logic behind that comes from. Not only that, but they try to teach them language. So it's showing them these really simple sentences and trying to get them to speak them out loud. And the fact that they aren't able to successfully speak them out loud will be evidence that they don't understand what the sentence says. So they need to be taught it over and over and over and over again. Like what Ido said, it's just confirmation bias. So here's what I came up with, or here's what I saw when I was doing, going through ABA training, working in ABA, is that's not a coherent understanding of language acquisition. And there's not any evidence or any kind of linguistic theory that's gonna support that any of those actions are going to help a child develop language. And so here's how I see it. I'm calling this the automata of the ABA prompting hierarchy. So, like I said, they have this hierarchy of prompts. If you ask a question and the kid gets the question wrong, you're supposed to move on to the first prompt. And then if they get it wrong, you start over again. You ask the question again, but this time you use the second prompt. If they get it wrong again, you start over, go to the third prompt, you start over, go to the fourth prompt. What's supposed to happen is that as a result of all of this extremely helpful prompting, they're supposed to be able to get it on their own. They're supposed to be able to get it without any kind of prompting, and that's the end result. And then once they're able to do it without any kind of prompting, and they do it enough times without any kind of prompting, then that's considered mastery of the skill. So on Chomsky's hierarchy of languages, so this is called a finite state automaton, but this would also be called a regular grammar. And on this language hierarchy, this is the most simple form of language. Then there's context-free, context-sensitive, and then recursively enumerable. That means human language. Language is recursive in that, like what I've been doing for the last however many minutes, I keep adding on to what I'm saying, right? There's no end to what I am able to say. It's recursive in that you can always add more and more and more onto what you're saying, and there's really no end. It's basically infinite. It's nearly infinite, which is an extraordinarily far cry from this prompting hierarchy that is supposedly supposed to teach children language, when it's literally the farthest thing from human language. Finite state automata are used in gumball machines. They are used in parking meters. This is the most simple form of grammar that can possibly exist, and ABA claims that they're using it to help kids acquire language. This is why I think linguistics needs to really become a lot more focused on autism, or at least more linguists need to take a look at things like ABA, because if you know literally anything about language acquisition, you will automatically know that this is total BS. And so this is where I think you can really see where mind blindness continues to undergird the underlying philosophy behind ABA, is that how can you believe that you are teaching language, and you are teaching language in this way, if you assume competence in the child? I think this proves that there is an assumption that these kids have no capacity for language. I think the implication of all of this is that the only way you can actually believe ABA teaches kids anything is if you believe that they are so mentally deficient that the only way they can learn is through reward and punishment. The only way that they can learn language is through what is basically regular grammar. The only way they can learn language is through the most oversimplified kind of grammar that does not come naturally to the human brain. We don't have automatas in our brain. That's not what human language is. So finally, this brings us to augmentative alternative communication methods. So the first method of I-ASC that you're going to hear about if you try to research I-ASC is something called facilitated communication. Essentially what facilitated communication is training a non-speaking person to be able to point at a letterboard and then eventually to a keyboard. And the way that they do that is by physically assisting the person. So it begins by hand over hand helping them point. As time goes on, it's supposed to move to just holding the elbow, and then holding their arm, and then maybe just holding their back so that they're able to keep their balance. The thing about FC is that there are people that have learned how to use, have learned how to spell and to type, and become independent as a result of using facilitated communication. If you ever read about FC, if you ever read the literature, you are not going to see that. What you are going to see is numerous studies that show that the person that is assisting the non-speaker is going to have undue influence on the non-speaker. And so for that reason, it's been really debunked. So, like I said, there are people that have learned how to use FC that have become independent communicators as a result of FC. I think the biggest thing is that it really comes down to the communication partner. The other main I-ASC method is RPM, the rapid prompting method. So this is very different. It's the same goal of teaching, of training a non-speaker or a more limited speaker to use a letterboard by pointing, spelling, pointing and spelling on a letterboard, and then eventually to use keyboards and a tablet and be able to type independently. But it's pretty distinct. So there's very little physical contact. So basically what RPM does, the rapid prompting, is very frequent verbal prompting by the communication partner. So with both of these methods, a really big part of it is that it takes a really, really long time to be able to establish these skills. For some people, it takes longer than others. Some people are faster than others to learn. So I'm really going to focus on RPM more than facilitated communication, because RPM has kind of prevailed as being less biased, right? That there's less influence from the communication partner to the non-speaker. This was created by a woman named Soma Mukhopadhyay. She created RPM as a result of, basically, she had a child named Ido Mukhopadhyay who had very significant traits of autism, very significant dyspraxia, and is non-speaking. It's a pretty inspiring story, honestly. So number one, when you read about RPM, almost every single time in virtually every paper written about RPM, right off the bat, they're going to equate FC and RPM as being the same thing, or they'll say that RPM is just a variation of FC, when I don't think that's really the case. So the way it's described, the way RPM is described, is not only is it this verbal prompting to help a person type, but it begins by the prompter, the communication partner, the teacher, is supposed to basically evaluate the skills and the challenges of the child that they're working with. Does the child learn more visually? Do they learn through moving their bodies? Do they learn through listening? And, what are their strengths with these different learning methods? And the way that she kind of starts this off is by creating a kind of rhythm in the way that they communicate with the non-speaker. So it starts they give a point of information, immediately ask a question, and then wait for a response. Or immediately ask a question and then give two options. So it can be something really basic, in my hands I'm holding a green pen and I'm holding a black pen. Which pen do you want? The green pen or the black pen? And then they choose. But it gets increasingly more advanced, and advanced in the point of information. The question becomes more advanced, the options become more advanced, and eventually it's supposed to not just be a set of options that the student chooses from. The option is the letterboard, right? The option becomes communicating through open language. And so that's the goal, is that eventually you start to get them to use a letterboard more and more and more. And when they're using the letterboard, this is where the rapid prompting, this is kind of the end result, or the most advanced stage of the rapid prompting, is that it's supposed to be as they are pointing or typing, they are verbally prompted in a way that's like, pay attention, keep going, you're doing great, like prompting like that. It's not, so at first the prompt was point of information, questions, options, and that creates that rhythm of like prompting, and that prompts a response. But it becomes like, increasingly less invasive to the point where the prompts are basically just to like keep that person paying attention. I thought about this for a really long time. I wasn't totally sure how I wanted to do this part of the video. So there are like a ton of videos of people that have learned how to successfully do this. And there are people who are my age and sometimes even younger who, through RPM, have become almost entirely independent typers. So at first I was considering like putting some of these videos in this video. For copyright reasons, I'm not going to do that, but also, I didn't consult with I didn't consult with anyone in creating this video. I don't want to include anyone in my video that doesn't want to be associated with me. And also, a lot of the people that are in these videos are minors. So I'm an adult. I don't want to do anything weird. So what I'm going to do instead of putting any one of these videos in my video is I'm going to point you in the direction, not just point you, but I'm going to show specifically where you can go to watch these videos right now. So, like, what I want you to do is pause this video and go and watch the videos that I'm going to show you. So, let's go back to United for Communication Choice. If you go to, at the top, there is the resources, and then you scroll down to see for yourself. That's the first option. And you can look at documentaries, movies, and television. But I think even better than that is the videos of advanced learners. So the first video is Puppet No Strings. The second one is When People See Me Typing. So I encourage you, these are pretty long, but I encourage you to watch those in particular. And the other place that you can go is to Soma Mukhopadhyay's YouTube channel. So go do that right now. And like, I seriously mean, like, pause this video and go watch those videos, because it's undeniable. It's completely undeniable what you see. And so I think these particular, so the two teenagers that are in these videos are 16 and 17 years old. So they're like relatively young. I wish they would update this website. I really wish they would update it. So Soma Mukhopadhyay has her own like RPM like clinic. She trains other people to learn how to use RPM, like to work with their child or with other non-speakers. But there are other clinics that do very, very similar things to RPM. They just don't directly go through Soma Mukhopadhyay. They don't like use her materials. They genuinely do like have like a variation of RPM. So Ido Mukhopadhyay he's in his 30s now, and he's written like 5 or 6 books. He's a poet. He's written books in English and Bengali and Hindi. Yeah, so he's talked about how even though he at first he needs some prompting to like initiate typing, eventually he starts to get into a rhythm where he really doesn't need any prompting at all. I think that's probably the case for a lot of different people, is that like even if they do need prompting in the very beginning, if they really get into it and they really like enjoy writing like Tito does, then like I think they just keep going and going and going, and it's not really like, it takes a really long time, but they don't necessarily need to be prompted the entire time. And so these people you would call, I think can be considered much more independent. So has there been any research on this group of people? Mostly no. Mostly no. So I'm going to start with the exception, and then I'll talk about all of the other academic scholarship on RPM, which, if you can even call it that. So let's begin with literacy and non-speaking people. So I'm not totally sure if this paper is peer-reviewed yet, but it came out in 2024 from the Jaswal lab at the University of Virginia. So they used an app on a tablet to, quote, measure participants' knowledge of spelling that did not require that they speak or generate text. Participants played a game that involved tapping sequentially pulsing targets on an iPad as quickly as they could. And the results were that, quote, our findings suggest that at least 5 times more participants have foundational literacy skills than would be expected from professional estimates based on non-speaking people's overt behavior. Hi there. So when I was originally filming this, there was a dog barking in the background. It was super annoying, and this is a really important part of the video, so I just decided to refilm this. And you're gonna see me again in a couple minutes after this too, because it wasn't just an isolated dog bark, unfortunately. So this study had a sample of 31 participants, and they were all above the age of 15, and they were all non-speaking autistic people, of course. So this study had 4 different sections. Within each section, there were multiple trials. There were basically one section used meaningful sentences, and the other 3 sections were not meaningful. And, I'll explain what I mean by that. But basically for each section, the participants were using an iPad, and there would be one pulsating either letter or symbol, and it was either letters or symbols, that it wasn't like mixed in together at all. And so what happened was that there would be one letter or symbol that would pulsate. All they had to do was just tap the pulsating letter or symbol as fast as they possibly could. And the second that they, immediately after they tapped it, it would, the next symbol would start to pulsate. And so for the meaningful section, they had several different sentences, but basically the way they would start it was that the researcher would speak the sentence aloud, and, on the tablet what would happen is that each letter that was within the sentence, one at a time, would pulsate, and so they just had to tap the letters that were in the sentence, obviously in the order that it was spelled, and all they had to do was tap the letters that were pulsating. And they never saw a written version of the sentence. They only listened to the sentence, right? And so for the meaningless sections, one of them was using letters, and for that they just had the same sentences that they had for the meaningful section, but the letters were in reverse, so it didn't make any sense, and it wasn't something that the researchers were able to speak aloud before the trial would start, because it's just not something that can be pronounced. And so then the other 2 sections used the symbols, right, that were non-letters. So this is not a direct, and they say this in the study, that this was an indirect measure of literacy in comparison to data taken on non-autistic subjects. They're looking for, basically patterns that show up in people that are literate. There were a few different patterns that they looked for, but the main one was that they should have been able to type press the letters for the meaningful section faster than any of the meaningless sections. Because if you are literate and if you understood the sentence that was spoken to you, then you should already know, what letter is going to come next. You can already anticipate what letters you're going to have to type out, even, before, they start pulsating. And for, the random stuff, you're not going to just be able to anticipate what's going to come next, because it's not, none of them were meaningful. So what they found was, like I said, that 5 times the number of participants showed these signs of literacy compared to professional estimates, which professional estimates being that non-speaking people have extremely low rates of literacy and extremely low literacy skills. I should have said this at the very beginning, but not only were these individuals not touched by anyone, but no one was holding the iPad for them. They were doing this totally independently. And there's just no other studies that are like this. So even though this isn't a direct measure of literacy, you kind of, when you're doing research on something that where there's no other research on it in any way, you kind of have to start somewhere, and this is where they started. There's nothing else like this. There's nothing in the literature that is anything like this. Like I said, this came out in 2024. I mean, this is such a recent study, and you're not going to find anything else like this in the literature. So you're simply not going to find any study that directly involves non-speaking autistic adults that can type independently. Like, there are no studies that have independent typing non-speaking adults. There's nothing. So what's the rest of the literature in RPM then, if none of it has any subjects that have actually learned how to use RPM, let alone use it, have basically kind of graduated out of RPM and can just do it independently. So there's one study, other than this, the one study that actually involved non-speaking subjects was Chen 2012, and they didn't even look at the literacy, right? They didn't actually look at anything to do with the language that came out of non-speakers using I-ASC. What they looked at was basically things that were auxiliary to RPM. The questions they asked were does RPM decrease repetitive behaviors like stimming? Does it increase joint attention? And joint attention is basically, the way they defined it was and this is how it's usually defined, is does the child make eye contact with their teacher or the adult that they're learning from? Are they sharing the gaze of the person that they're learning from? And that's called joint attention. And so one of the results that they came up with was maybe joint attention doesn't actually demonstrate whether or not a child with autism is learning. If anything, making eye contact can be distracting and can inhibit the learning process, which I think is true. Basically, the rest of the literature is just literature reviews that are reviewing this paper over and over and over again. The main paper that is kind of quoted and requoted and reviewed endlessly in the literature is the only study investigating the rapid prompting method has serious methodological flaws, but data suggests the most likely outcome is prompt dependency. Lang 2014. So, I mean, it says it all in the title, right? The only study investigating the rapid prompting method, which is Chen 2012, has serious methodological flaws. The serious methodological flaws are, the biggest issue is just that it was a really small group of people that they were testing. It was, all children, and I think they all had worked with Soma Mukhopadhyay. So that's the gist of the methodological flaws in Chen 2012, which is yeah, but it's the first study that's ever been done on RPM, so how are they supposed to get some huge sample size when it's literally the only paper that's ever been done on this subject? The conclusions that they get from this paper, that the data suggests the most likely outcome is prompt dependency, but the data actually doesn't show that, though, because that's not what they're researching in Chen 2012, that's not one of the hypotheses that they test. They do not test prompt dependency. Hello again. So once again, dog was barking. So in Chen 2012, they used a sample size of 9 children that were all between the ages of 8 and 14. And basically the study consisted of, the researchers reviewing footage of, reviewing video recordings of Soma Mukhopadhyay working with these 9 children, doing RPM with them. So the methodological flaws, the main methodological flaws that are described in Lang 2014 is that this is a really, really small sample size, and also Soma Mukhopadhyay was the only one that was working with the children that they were studying. For any research to be truly, rigorous, and for it to be as high quality as possible, you have to, of course, have a very large sample size and preferably diverse. But, this is the first study that was ever done on this subject. So, I guess you could say, yeah, it's a methodological flaw, but, you have to start somewhere with any kind of research. So it's not necessarily like there were methodological flaws in, other aspects of the study. It was really just the small sample size and the fact that it was only one therapist that was working with, or one teacher that was working with these 9 participants. I think to say it's like that these are really deep methodological flaws, it's like, okay, what do you really mean by that when it's in this context of it being the only study that's ever been done on this subject? And so their determination in Lang 2014 is that the data suggests that RPM causes prompt dependency. And so I don't think the data actually shows that, because, for a number of reasons, but number one, for the very reason that they describe Chen 2012 as being methodologically flawed, which is how can you make that determination that RPM causes prompt dependency if you're, how can you make that conclusion based on such a small sample size? So it's really like it's a really huge contradiction that I don't know, this paper, this review of Chen 2012 is what basically subsequent reviews of Chen 2012 always cite, and systematic literature reviews of RPM, they always cite Lang 2014, even though there's this just inherent contradiction in the conclusions that they come to, which in itself is a methodological flaw. The study that accuses, or the review that accuses Chen 2012 of being methodologically flawed is also therefore methodologically flawed, because you can't possibly come to a conclusive determination based on such a small sample. The other thing is that these are very young kids. 8 is very, very young, and 14 is still pretty young to be learning RPM. And so that's a really big part of what RPM is that it takes a very, very long time for non-speaking people with things like dyspraxia or apraxia to be able to consistently use letterboards and consistently be able to, point their finger and build up that kind of motor control. As far as I've seen, I don't think that there are a lot of even 14-year-olds that end up being very independent at all. So and for the most part, the most independent typers and spellers and writers are usually adults. In the two videos that we watched earlier from United for Communication Choice that had a 16-year-old boy and a 17-year-old boy, they, I'm sure that they had been going through RPM for many, many years. When Ido Kedar wrote his memoir, I believe he was in high school, and I'm pretty sure that he started RPM when he was 7. So it probably took him like around a decade to be able to really become a fluent writer. Basically, in RPM, towards the beginning of the RPM process, it is inherently prompt dependent. There is really no way to do RPM where the kid isn't going to be prompt dependent in the beginning. Because if very young children could just, immediately be able to perform the tasks that are being taught in RPM, then they probably wouldn't need to be in RPM in the first place, because it's a really gradual teaching of motor control. In addition to, and the way that they teach motor control is also by also doing teaching at the same time, like teaching, different subjects, or just, there are a lot of different kind of ways that they teach in RPM, but like the way that it starts is that you're given, just a couple of options for the student to choose from, and then you don't even start with the full letterboard. You start with partial, like small parts of the letterboard, and then eventually you get to the full letterboard, and then eventually you get to typing and becoming more independent. But their conclusion that these young children doing RPM are prompt dependent, it's that's the whole therapy. And so the conclusion is it just doesn't make, it's supposed to be this kind of slam dunk, and it's not, because that you're just misunderstanding what RPM even is by describing as being very prompt dependent when it is necessarily prompt dependent in the beginning. Another thing is that they're not specifically looking at prompt dependency. There are several different hypotheses. Like I said before, they look at repetitive behaviors and joint attention. Joint attention was really the only most definitive conclusion that they were able to come to, that conclusion being that joint attention doesn't display, the learning process for autistic children the way that it really does with non-autistic children. But for the prompting questions, it was the rate, how many prompts the teacher gives, how what kinds of prompts, and how often did the students give correct answers in response to the prompts. So it's they were looking at a lot of different things. In a way, maybe you could come to a conclusion about prompt dependency based on that data, but it's not specifically what they were setting out to study in Chen 2012. And so the last thing is that, and I'm going to expound on this when I go back to myself in a second, but the last thing is, and I mentioned this earlier in the video, that in facilitated communication, there's this concept of the ideomotor effect, which is when the facilitator has a lot of influence over the non-speaker that's trying to communicate. And I'm going to talk about this a lot more at the end of the video, because this is a really important point. And so basically what the ideomotor effect is, the facilitator kind of has a subconscious influence over what they are, help, like the communication that they are helping facilitate, physically helping the person communicate, like in that physical assistance, they are subconsciously, basically manipulating what is being written. It's like a Ouija board. That's what they always say, is that it's like a Ouija board. I'll talk more about FC at the end, but how exactly is that supposed to happen in RPM? Right? I mean, like, and they don't specifically say the ideomotor effect in Lang 2014. This is why, like, as I'm about to start talking about, they make this comparison between RPM and FC and basically equate them as being the same thing, when there is no proof that the ideomotor effect can happen at all in RPM. So to equate them and to kind of suggest that the prompt dependency that is, seen in the data in Chen 2012 could be reminiscent of that kind of influence in FC, that kind of manipulation in FC. I think that's a really, like, kind of bad faith comparison to make, because RPM and FC are fundamentally very different. Once again, in RPM, what they do is that they'll hold the letterboard for the other person, but I mean, they don't touch the student at all, right? There is no touching. So, that's the other thing, is that it's like, well, can you really come to this definitive conclusion that the teacher is just doing everything and the student doesn't really have any kind of autonomy in anything that's going on? It's just like, the evidence just isn't really there. And so basically what they mean by prompt dependency is supposed to be, they're supposed to be like, they're invoking FC. They're invoking the issues with FC, that the facilitator is having undue influence on the non-speaker. And so basically the conclusion that they make is that they say that RPM is really similar to FC, and for that reason, it can just be assumed that it's going to have the same flaws as FC. And I mean, the thing is that, like, this is something that is, like, absolutely acknowledged and discussed in people that do RPM, is that the communication partner, especially, if it's your parent that is helping you communicate, they might have a level of influence on the person that is spelling or typing. And, like, that's true, right? But the thing is that, like, if there were more RPM therapists, then maybe it wouldn't have everything to do with the parents. Maybe so many parents wouldn't have to become, their own kid's RPM therapist, because that's what happens most of the time. And so really, like, what it comes down to is FC is the same thing as RPM. Therefore, you can just take all of the research that's been done on FC and just say that that's the same thing as RPM. And so that means that you don't have to, do more research on RPM. You can just look at the FC research. That's all you have to look at. You don't have to do more research on RPM, because it's the same thing as FC. And there are papers that explicitly say this, that explicitly say there does not need to be any more research done on RPM, even though Chen 2012 is really the only paper that was ever actually specifically done on RPM. Like, there hasn't really been more research on RPM other than that. So it's like with all of these reviews, all of the reviews subsequent to Lang 2014 with the super long title, what all of them say is actually, because of everything that was said in Lang 2014, we have re-reviewed that there does not need to be, we have re-reviewed the facts that say that RPM is just prompt dependency, when in reality, they're just regurgitating the same paper that was already kind of BS. Like, that already jumped to these really huge conclusions. And the other thing that all of these papers do that I think is really ill-intentioned, like, I don't really know how else to say it other than I think they lie by omission. I think all of these reviews that are basically reviews of reviews of reviews, they all lie by omission in that they never mention the fact that there are people that have learned to communicate independently as a result of RPM. They never mention the fact that these people exist. And even the fact that there are adults, the fact that there are people that have been going through RPM, that have gone through RPM for years, that have written books, people like Tito, but also Ido and other people. So one of the main books that really, or I guess the book that really got me to look at RPM was Communication Alternatives in Autism. And every single chapter of that book is written by a different non-speaking person. I think a couple of them are a lot older and they learned how to type using FC. But for the most part, everyone else is RPM. It's hard to explain just how life-changing RPM has been for so many people. And you just have to read them for yourself. Like, you have to watch videos of these people yourself. You have to read their writing yourself because it is so compelling. It's so powerful. Like, Ido Mukhopadhyay, for example, his writing is so powerful. And, I mean, really, like, his writing style is very unique. Like, the language he uses is so poetic. And I read Plankton Dreams, which was a really short, it was like a 90-page book that he wrote. I think it came out in 2015. I mean, like, I can't for a moment entertain the idea that he did not write that himself. When you actually read the writing of these people that are non-speakers, like, I think if you actually take the time to read it, I don't think you can deny that it was them that wrote it, because these are experiences that are so unique. I don't, what could it be if they didn't write them? Was it all ghost written? Did Ido Kedar have a ghostwriter? Does Ido Mukhopadhyay have a ghostwriter? Who are these people that are writing whole novels from the perspective of non-speaking autistic people that are incredibly powerful and incredibly well written and don't want to take credit for it? Like, who are these ghostwriters? Because I don't, and that's the thing, is that it's like, in these papers that are reviews of Chen 2012, they don't even touch the fact that Ido and Autism Land exists. Like, they do not acknowledge the fact that these books exist at all. Because if you do that, then you have to create some kind of theory of, okay, then someone must have written them for them, right? Someone else had to have written them, or else you actually have to start to entertain the idea that Someone wrote these books. Someone's writing all of these blogs. So who is it if it's not them? You know, looking back at the videos of advanced spellers, like, there are really long videos that show people's hands as they type out sentences, and as they're sitting there with their parents who are basically saying nothing the entire time. Can you argue that they are prompt dependent? That what they wrote was a result of the prompts that the people around them gave them, which are next to none? Like, you can't make that argument, which is why they lie by omission, because they can't make the argument otherwise. The next issue that comes up in all of these papers is the claim of prompt dependency, you guys. So one of the biggest things about FC is that, like, even when a person does become a much more independent communicator, there are a lot of cases where people still choose to have a communication partner to prompt them, even if they are more independent. So, like, the idea that, like, RPM causes prompt dependency, it's like, in some cases, yes, in some cases, no, but regardless, like, the result is that people are communicating in a way that they would not be able to communicate otherwise. This claim of prompt dependency is really, like, it's not really explained what that means in this context of, like, you are prompt dependent, but you can also, like, type a whole book. So what does it mean to be dependent on prompting? If it means you're dependent on someone to help you pay attention and to help you maintain your train of thought, that's a very different prompt from something that is extremely influential. Like, that's a very different prompt from, like, someone holding your hand as you're typing. So the nature of the prompt dependency is never totally, like, explored. I don't think they in good faith they ever really argue what it means to be prompt dependent when the alternative is zero communication at all whatsoever. And the other thing is, okay, then what about ABA then? If prompt dependency is such a huge problem, then that is a problem in ABA too. No one ever brings that up. You're never going to see that in any paper. That, well, if the standard for prompt dependency is that any amount of prompt dependency is bad, then okay, I guess ABA is bad too then, if that's the standard that we're going by. And so then when it comes to this claim of ABA is evidence-based, but RPM is not, if the standards of RPM being evidence-based is that, like, there are virtually no academic articles about the, like, linguistic legitimacy of, like, independent typers that have used RPM, then what about the evidence behind ABA? Because there's not any evidence that ABA actually helps non-speakers at all. So that would mean that ABA isn't evidence-based either. But that is never mentioned. That's nowhere to be seen. So what's happening? What's going on that there is so much institutional force against, like, any genuine research on RPM? Why is that? Right? Why is it that there's so much institutional support behind ABA and nothing for RPM? This is where we get to the autism industrial complex. So there is a book called The Autism Industrial Complex. I have not read all of, like, the whole book, but I've read parts of it, but I've also read the paper on it. So the autism industrial complex is not just ABA agencies and the BCBA and the insurance companies that cover ABA services, it is much, much more widespread than that. In this paper, the title is Autism Inc., the Autism Industrial Complex. Really, the complex is made up of academic behaviorists, PhDs in behavioral psychology, teaching at institutions of higher education, and publishing studies and position papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals. B, non-autistic parents of autistic children. C, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, BACB, at multiple levels. And D, Autism Speaks, self-described as the world's largest scientific and advocacy organization for autism, which they describe as a global, multi-platform, neoliberal media organization, corporate-style policy lobbyist. And they didn't even include it on this list, but it's also the education system. So public schools, public and private schools, will get funding to, instead of create their own like special education curriculums and like systems, public schools will just like employ ABA people, and they'll just base their special education program on ABA, or have it like revolve around ABA. I forgot to mention this about RPM. It is a really common experience for non-speakers that use letterboards and tablets to be essentially discriminated against. Like, if they want to go to a new school and they want to be able to use a letterboard or their tablet in the classroom, they might be given the choice of, you can come to this school, but you can't use the letterboard. Or if you want to keep going to this school, you have to stop using your letterboard. You can't use it in the classroom. But also, they're discriminated against by doctors. Like, if their doctor learns that, oh, you let your child use a letterboard and you have your kid do RPM, doctors will reject them. Schools will reject them just because they use I-ASC that they learn to use because of RPM. So all of these different components of the autism industrial complex kind of revolve around ABA and ABA agencies. If we go back to how much compliance is too much compliance, and we go more towards the end of the article, they state that in 2017, one investment firm estimated that the market size for ABA services could be as high as $17 billion annually. And with the continued creation of various ABA specialists, certifications, and programs, that number is likely even greater now. I'm filming this in June 2025. This was written in 2021. It is certainly higher than $17 billion now. With this kind of information, it is evident that what drives the continued use of these services and how this vulnerable subset of children are not the primary focus. Given that the Behavior Analyst Certification Board requires no education and training on autism in general, let alone the cognitive and neurological characteristics of autism, basic child development, social and interpersonal skills, cultural issues, child autonomy and self-esteem, dietary issues, etc., it is shocking that most have not questioned their current scope in working with children with autism in the first place. So the kids that spend their whole childhoods in ABA end up with very few skills that they actually learned as a result of ABA, but they do get learned helplessness, low self-esteem, traits of PTSD, and for what? I mean, like, and where's the pushback? Where's the institutional pushback? Where is the critique of ABA in any of the literature on RPM? It's just not there. And this is why. The reason is that ABA makes a boatload of money for a lot of people every single year. I think RPM just isn't comparable to ABA really in any way when you look at the profitability of it. And that's what, like, in all of the a lot of the papers about RPM, they always mention the fact that Soma Mukhopadhyay makes money from doing, from RPM. From what I've seen, she seems to be like an extremely hardworking person. I don't think she's out there like going on like golf trips every weekend. Like, I think she's working with kids like around the clock and has been for like 2 decades. Not to mention everything that she does for her own child. ABA and RPM just couldn't be more different. I really think that they're totally like polar opposites. ABA doesn't allow for any kind of open communication. ABA is really oppressive and is aimed at suppressing the wills of the children that they work with. Not only do they want them to be compliant, but they discourage stimming, if not physically stop stimming. And not only that, but like the learning and the teaching that's in RPM is just the complete polar opposite of what happens in ABA. All of the teaching revolves around the skills and the challenges of that particular individual child. Like, if a kid is stimming, they do not discourage the child from stimming at all. If the kid is walking around the room stimming, you follow the kid as they're walking around. You do not tell them to stop. If they're typing or they're pointing and they get distracted, you can prompt them and say, hey, keep going, pay attention. But it's not, there isn't any kind of punishment or reward for any of these things. There is no operant conditioning involved with RPM at all. There is no behaviorist premise to it in any way. I really want to take a hard look at the autism industrial complex. So ABA is called therapy. It's called ABA services. And the definition of a service is that one party provides some kind of action that provides the other party with help or some kind of benefit, and the other party pays the first party for that action. So person number 1 does something that benefits person number 2, and person number 2 pays for that. There's a monetary transaction that happens. So in the case of ABA services, I think we need to question, are these really services? If the vast majority of the children that undergo ABA do not receive any measurable benefit, there is no research that shows that non-speaking and limited speaking children that go through ABA actually learn anything, aside from very, very rudimentary things like extremely basic requests. Above that, there is no real proof that they're actually gaining anything as a result of years and years of ABA. So ABA therapy does not meet the definition of a service. So just hypothetically, in theory, this is not my opinion, I'm just creating a hypothetical scenario as an expression of my First Amendment right as an American citizen. So, hypothetically, if you were to, not me, I'm not saying this, but it could be said by someone else that isn't me, that, okay, if ABA doesn't fit the definition of a service, then what is the relationship between ABA consultants and their main clientele, which is non-speaking autistic children? So we have ABA and we have the non-speaking autistic children that undergo ABA services. If the ABA people are making money if the insurance company makes money, and the education system makes money, and the academics make money, and the BACB makes money, in this interaction with children with autism, what do those children receive? What is the benefit that they receive? Well, we don't know. So what is the relationship? The autism industrial complex makes money, and the children do not receive anything. Hypothetically, it could be argued this is not a relationship of service provider and service receiver. This is a relationship of exploitation. Hypothetically, these kids are providing a service for the autism industrial complex that provides the autism industrial complex with monetary gain and profit, and the children gain nothing. I think it could be argued that that would make them unpaid laborers. And even more than that, unpaid child laborers. In the Autism Industrial Complex paper, they describe autistic bodies as a raw material that the Autism Industrial Complex extracts from. Except bodies are not raw materials unless you're harvesting their organs. People are not raw materials. When people are performing an action that creates revenue, that is labor. That is a service of labor. So when the Autism Industrial Complex extracts from children with autism, what they are extracting is child labor. So you can disagree with me on literally everything about RPM. You can walk away with this saying RPM is a hoax, Soma Mukhopadhyay is a con man, con woman, and you can say that Ido Kedar and Ido Mukhopadhyay did not write their books themselves, they had ghostwriters. You can say that, the critical period hypothesis was right. There is only one language development pathology. In autism, non-speaking people just have no capacity for language. You can say all of those things. But you cannot deny that ABA is fundamentally unethical and irredeemable. And so this is why this is so important to me. This is why I think the linguistic perspective on autism is so important, because the entire autism industrial complex is placated on an absence of information. So if there actually were to be, widespread research on things like RPM, then the whole complex would crumble. Like, the only way that ABA can continue to be a fundamental part of the way that autism research and treatment exists is if there is an absence of information about the linguistic capabilities of limited and non-speaking autistic people. It can only exist on an absence of information. So that's why this is so important. That's why linguistic research about autism is so important, because it could absolutely change everything. In Ido's op-ed, he used the word liberated. When he was put into RPM, he was liberated from ABA. He was liberated from a life of silence and an absence of communicating with anyone at any time. And he's not the only person that's written about this. He is not the only person that would describe this as a liberation. And so that's what we're looking at, is tens of thousands of children that are stuck in ABA with no benefit. They do not receive education. They do not receive independent functioning. They do not receive communicative skills. They receive nothing. And through their subjugation, they create billions and billions of dollars that they never see. They never see the benefits of the labor that they perform. And so I guess that brings us all the way back to the beginning, that Marx said that humans are social creatures, and I think at the core of that, humans are linguistic creatures. If we are denied our linguistic nature, we are denied our lives. We are denied our humanity. And that is the reality of so many people with autism, not just in the US, but across the globe. And so the few papers on RPM that are more neutral or positive about RPM, all of them I've seen have come from Ireland, and I think that's because they're not impacted by the autism industrial complex the way that it functions in the US because of our awesome privatized healthcare system. This is all able to proliferate, but it's not just the insurance companies, and it's not just the ABA agencies, it's academia, right? It's all of these papers that come out that say RPM is not an evidence-based practice, and they have all of these impossible expectations of RPM. There are several papers that argue that there should be absolutely no more research done on RPM because it has been definitively proven that it is unethical and ineffective, even though it has not been definitively proven. And so I think there's a lot of bad faith actors in this whole system. At the end of the day, the only way that this can change is if there is not just research on language and autism, but there has to be a social movement that pushes against this huge system. So I have to wrap this video up because my laptop is almost out of storage. So sorry about that. I have more storage in my laptop now. So I just want to wrap all of this up by tying together different concepts that I've talked about throughout not only this video, but my previous video. I want to start by returning to FC and this concept of the ideomotor effect. So if you Google FC, facilitated communication, one of the first things that you're going to see is that, number one, that's a pseudoscience, and number two, that it is extremely unethical because it has led to numerous false abuse accusations. The first thing I'm going to say is that there have also been positive abuse accusations that have been confirmed as that came out through FC, but there are far more false abuse accusations. And I don't know what kind of words I can and can't say on YouTube, but abuse accusations of a certain nature, of an inappropriate nature. And so these were really heinous accusations that were made for many different people. There's so many different cases of this happening, and there are, for a lot of people, it really kind of ruined their lives and split up families and stuff. So I think there are a few different reasons that this happens. I think the biggest thing is that it comes down to a lack of regulation, because if you do go ahead and read that list on Wikipedia of all of the false abuse accusations, very quickly you should be able to identify a pattern that is the facilitator, the person that's helping the non-speaking person, when they allegedly see that the non-speaker that they're facilitating the communication for, that they are spelling out abuse accusations. A lot of those facilitators were extremely unexperienced. There was one example of a facilitator who had literally not only never done facilitated communication before, but really never been around like autistic people before. And like, so when she saw basically the person that she was working with, when she saw them kind of doing self-interest behaviors, they were kind of hitting themselves, that kind of thing, she interpreted that as being like, as the person like reenacting abuse that they had incurred, which is like, how do you come to that conclusion if you know anything about this population of autistic people? And there was another example of a really sad example of a woman who made her child overdose on drugs, and her child died because through typing on her BlackBerry, for those of who are watching that are too young, a BlackBerry being a tiny flip phone with a very small keyboard, a very, very small keyboard that, you know, depending on what BlackBerry it was, like the keyboard, you'd have to press the button multiple times to get whatever letter. You know, I don't know exactly what kind of phone she had, but like, you know, that through typing through the BlackBerry with her son, who no one else ever witnessed, she apparently saw that he typed that he was being abused and that he wanted his life to end, and so she ended it for him. And I mean, I'm sorry, but like, that's not even, the fact that that could even be called facilitated communication in the first place is, I think, really absurd. It's just not, you know, facilitated communication describes, like RPM, it's not just like there are instances of facilitated communication where anyone can just like come in and meet a non-speaking person for the first time and just start holding their arm and facilitating their communication for them. It's not like that at all. It's an ongoing process of years and years and years. And like I've mentioned already, there are many people that have become very independent communicators as a result of learning FC. Some people that have become, you know, autism advocates and have really become very independent people that learned FC. But for a lot of these people that really truly became independent communicators and started living independent lives, they learned from, they were trained by people that were experts. In the book Communication Alternatives in Autism, the 2 chapters, there might be a couple more chapters that have people that use FC, I can't remember, but I know that the first 2 chapters were written by people that used FC, and they were taught FC by the people that created FC, like the experts on FC, right? So it's like, I mean, of course, these, you know, all of these cases of false abuse accusations are really horrible. They're really, really bad. But with any kind of therapy, if the therapy is done completely incorrectly by a completely unqualified person, can you really call what that therapy is? Can you really say that it is that therapy if it's being done totally wrong? I mean, can you make any kind of real conclusion on how well a therapy works based on people that are doing it wrong? And I should have also said that there was also a really terrible case of a professor who was facilitating communication for a very highly disabled man, and she assaulted him and abused him in an inappropriate way. And she basically claimed that she was the only one that could communicate with him, and that she was able to communicate with him in ways that no one else could. And that in itself, I just think comes back to, this is an issue of regulation. How can that should just never occur. There should never be a time for any therapy in any context where a highly disabled person, a highly disabled non-speaking person, is being treated by one individual, where one individual has so much power over the disabled person. It's just, that just shouldn't happen at all. And so, like I've said in my own experience, that's a really huge problem in ABA. Not, of course, this extent of this specific case being uniquely terrible, but there is, in ABA, there is only, a lot of the time, there's only one person that works with any given child. And maybe they have a team that is assisting the behavioral technician, behind the scenes to be able to do ABA therapy. A lot of the time, it's just the behavioral technician. It's just one person that is alone with the child, or the autistic person. And not only is there very little accountability at all, little to none accountability in those situations, but it's like that person is their whole education. Like that one person can a lot of the time, if they don't also go to school and ABA and like do both, if for the kids that only do ABA, that is their only source of education. That is their only, for a lot of people, for a lot of kids that only do ABA for their whole education, that person might be their only connection to the outside world. So that is a lot of power that person has. And I just don't think, no matter what it is, no matter what therapy it is, there should never be just one person that has so much power over a very disabled person. In all cases, that is bad. So to go back to, could the idiomotor effect take place in RPM? In Lang 2014, they suggest that the idiomotor effect could be even worse in RPM because the teacher or the communication partner is holding the letterboard themselves. And, through holding the letterboard, maybe they could move it in a way that they change what is being spelled, and they can manipulate what is being spelled. And it's okay, but, of course, the only way that you can really, make this conclusion is, number one, you have to lie by omission. You have to omit that there are many non-speaking people that have become very independent typers, that there's no letterboard, no one's holding anything for anyone else, and they're just typing on their own. How would the idiomotor effect take place? In that instance, it just couldn't, right? It simply couldn't happen. And so they that's why they have to lie by omission. That's why they can't say independent communicating non-speaking people exist. The other thing is that So RPM has been, so basically, the other thing is that Soma Mukhopadhyay brought RPM to the United States, I believe in 2001. It might have been earlier than 2001, but either 2000 or 2001, and she had been developing it while living in India. I think she moved around a little bit throughout the region at that time, but mostly she was living in India while she was developing RPM and developing it with Tito, her son. And she hadn't, as from what I remember, I don't think she had ever worked with other children until she came to the United States. And so RPM has been around for more than 20 years, and to my knowledge, there has never been a single case of any kind of false abuse accusation that's come out of RPM. It's just never happened. So if you really think that RPM and FC are flawed in the same ways, and they're really just, RPM is just a variation of FC, and therefore it can't be trusted for the same reasons that FC can't be trusted, then why has that never happened, right? Why is it that FC has had all of these false abuse accusations and there has been nothing in RPM ever? There hasn't been one. So, just in my opinion, just speculate, I think it's very possible that RPM is more reliable than facilitated communication for that reason, because even and basically what happens, to return to the the concept that in RPM a lot of children's main RPM kind of communication partner, there are very few clinics that do RPM in a professional way. There's Soma Mukhopadhyay's, of course, but there are other ones as well. Less RPM clinics exist than, fingers on my hand. So what happens a lot of the time is that people get trained. I don't know exactly if other clinics do this as well, but I know that Soma Mukhopadhyay trains other people to do RPM, and a lot of the time it's parents, teaching parents how to do RPM with their child. And the main issue that comes out of that, so in FC, when you have a really unexperienced person that's never done FC before or done it very little, then what can happen is the ideomotor effect, right? Or, allegedly the ideomotor effect. I don't know. It's kind of hard to say, but, clearly something goes wrong. In all of these instances of false abuse accusation, clearly something goes wrong. In RPM, when you have an inexperienced RPM communication partner, the main problem is just that, the communication just might not be very fluent. In one of the chapters of Communication Alternatives in Autism, Philip Reyes, who is a non-speaking person that originally started learning RPM from Soma Mukhopadhyay, and Soma lives in Texas. Of course, not all non-speaking people live in Texas. So, when Philip had to go back home, his mother became his RPM teacher and communication partner. And he described that at the beginning, it was really hard, but eventually, she became more skilled, and they became, they were able to work together a lot better. Eventually, he became a full, a very independent typer. He wrote that whole chapter. He has a blog. He writes a lot of poetry. So it's the issue with that is just when it comes to an unexperienced RPM teacher versus an inexperienced facilitated communicator, the ideomotor effect just doesn't happen. Like, there just aren't the risks with RPM that there are with FC. And I think that if FC is done correctly and it's done by experts, then it can absolutely be effective. But because in this country, there's so little regulation around special education and, services for highly disabled children, that it really comes down to, like, there are just a lot of problems with there are just so many problems with any kind of service. But I think, especially with RPM, when it's like a professional like Soma Mukhopadhyay or in other clinics, and usually for those other clinics, to from what I understand, what they do isn't always exactly the same thing as RPM, but they're very similar, like fundamentally very similar, in that there is no touching, there is no like suppression of self-stimulating behavior, that kind of thing. A lot of the time in the sessions that they have with the professional RPM teacher working with the child, from everything that I've seen of like recordings of RPM teachers and like the sessions that they do, there's always another adult in the room, usually multiple other adults in the room. A lot of the time it's, one parent and then a person that is recording the whole session. So a lot of these sessions get fully recorded. And, the purpose of this is to show that what's happening is safe. That there's no way that you can have a person, like the really terrible case of the professor taking advantage of the disabled person she was working with and creating an unconsensual relationship with him. That just can't happen if there are multiple people that are able to communicate with that person, and that just can't happen if there is more oversight and regulation and accountability. Like, there are so many things that have to go so wrong in order for that level of abuse to occur. So to wrap things up, I want to return to unitedforcommunicationchoice.org and their facts page. Let's start with one of the bullet points that they have is that there is no anatomical basis for assuming non-speaking individuals are non-thinking. Speech and language are processed in different parts of the brain. Assuming that an individual with impaired speech has impaired language or lacks the intelligence to produce complex communication is neither appropriate or evidence-based. So, of course, I talked about this at length in my first video, but I just want to reiterate that there is no neurological evidence that non-speaking autistic people do not acquire language. I just want to really impress on everyone that's watching that this claim that anyone could ever fully have the inability to acquire language is an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. Because as a species, like I've already explained, as a species, we evolved around human language. The way that our evolution took place revolved around language. And like anthropologically and just in so many ways, our society and the way like that, just the way that everything works when it comes to human beings, everything really revolves around language. So the idea that anyone could be born without the ability to acquire language, like, wouldn't that have to entail like a really serious level of brain damage? I mean, how could anyone have an intact brain and not be able to acquire language, without any sort of really pervasive brain damage. I mean, like, the reason, yes, there are different regions of the brain that we've identified having to do with different aspects of language, but, like, just to give an example, with the FOXP2 gene, which has been identified as sort of a language gene, they've also found it in birds, and there's an example of in birds that, like, there's a specific kind of bird where at a specific time of the year they have the mating season, and during the mating season their FOXP2 gene basically, like, activates, and while they're chirping, the FOXP2 gene is activated. In humans, we know that we have the FOXP2 gene, but there's no kind of parallel of, like, seeing an activation, right? Because language takes place throughout the whole, there's so many different parts of the brain that are involved in language that there's not just, like, one thing that can light up and, like, that's the language part. Like, our brains are so complex, and language has so many different parts to it that there's just no way that, unless, like, even people that are in comas, we know that there are cases where people that have been in comas can hear everything that's being said, right? Even where, like, a person has really serious brain damage, they can still absolutely understand language. Like, there's just this really huge exceptionalism when it comes to non-speaking people, because even in the cases that they have underconnectivity in the linguistic regions of the brain, that is not proof of a total absence of language. And so the last thing, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the facts page, the last bullet point is banning exposure to a method of communication has been tried before. It represents one of the more egregious errors in the history of education. In 1880, the International Conference on the Education of the Deaf adopted a resolution that recommended against the use of teaching sign language in schools. Out of 144 delegates, only one was deaf. The resolution resulted in the effective ban on the use of sign language in schools in the United States, a ban that lasted for over 100 years. It wasn't until 1980 that the International Congress on the Education of the Deaf agreed that all deaf children have the right to flexible communication in the mode or combination of modes in which best meets their individual needs. For over 100 years, signing deaf individuals were forced underground, unable to use or be taught sign language in schools. When I learned about RPM, in my mind, I made the exact same connection, that this is exactly like what happened with sign language, is that it was wrongly claimed that sign language was an inferior form of language, and that was the basis on which sign language was banned. It was a tragedy of a really, really long time where deaf people were denied, especially in a time before hearing aids and cochlear implants and that kind of thing. Sign language was the only way that deaf people could really acquire language and be able to communicate effectively. And so, of course, people still tried to use sign language if they could, but for a lot of people, they just were completely left behind. And so I think this is a really similar thing with RPM, where not only has it been, like, officially determined that RPM is not evidence-based, it's pseudoscientific, and whatever else, it's also, like, people that use RPM are discriminated against. And there's a whole huge system that pushes against anyone from ever even learning about RPM in the first place. It took me like 2 years of doing like my own research on autism and reading about autism, and I worked for 2 different companies that worked with autistic children, and it wasn't until really after that I managed to come across what RPM was. And like since then it's just been this, like, I've been on this learning journey of trying to understand what it is and why it's so marginalized. So it's really, really, really heavily suppressed. You know, it hasn't been made illegal, but I mean, I think most parents of autistic children that are non-speaking just have no idea that it exists at all, because the suppression is so pervasive, and it's been suppressed for so long, and that people just think that it's like a pipe dream to imagine that non-speaking people could ever have any kind of language in their brains. People, the way that FC and RPM truthers, like, the way that they push against both of these things is that they say that, like, you know, you're living this fantasy of believing that your child could ever learn to use language in any way. It's a Ouija board, it's pseudoscience, blah blah blah. And like, people get like really badly harassed on the internet. I'm anticipating some amount of harassment for all the things that I've said in this video, but not Soma Mukhopadhyay, but another woman who's like a director of an RPM adjacent clinic has written about how, like, there have been times where on the internet she's just been like incessantly harassed, and there have been just huge harassment campaigns against her for the work that she does, and it's really, really horrible. So it's not just like, you know, psychologists will roll their eyes if you bring up RPM. Like, people will get like threats. You know, it's really bad. It's such a tragedy, because how many people are denied any form of communication on a totally, like, on a basis of no evidence, on a basis of just absolutely nothing. And, you know, the basis being basically what mind blindness is, of the way that a person looks can lead to a series of assumptions that are extremely dehumanizing. And I think at its core, that comes from eugenics. That is the legacy of eugenics. So, just to give an example, with Tourette's, and Tourette's is a tic disorder where people have motor, you know, physical movements and vocalizations, and, you know, they speak sentences or just words involuntarily. And there are a lot of different types of tics, but one of the defining features of Tourette's is that before a person has a tic, they have something called a premonitory urge, which is essentially that they can feel that they're going to have a tic before it happens. Like, they feel an urge to say something or to do something before it happens, and that kind of what defines tics and Tourette's versus things like functional tics, where, you know, it's a different experience. So with Tourette's, if you just looked at a person with Tourette's and like tried to analyze all of their tics as being like intentional, as having like a meaning that connects to other things, then, or like if you just looked at a person with Tourette's and tried to come to a bunch of different conclusions based off of their outward appearance, then as a person without Tourette's, then I think all of those conclusions would be completely wrong. You know, assigning a kind of intentionality, would be very wrong, or trying to understand what is causing these things to happen, what that cognitive, experience and feeling of having tics, what that's like, if you don't actually ask the person with Tourette's yourself and you've never experienced Tourette's because you aren't a person that developed in that way, then I think you would be totally wrong about any of those observations, about any of those assumptions. So in non-speaking people that are particularly apraxic, something that they'll describe is that like they will have these kind of bursts of movement that, or vocalizations or other things that I think is distinct from Tourette's because of the, and this is something that I'm curious about. So any non-speaking people that would like to, share their experience, please go ahead. But I believe that there is not a premonitory urge that's involved in those kinds of bursts of movement and involuntary vocalizations. But of course, like, that's very similar to Tourette's. And so it's like when you see a non-speaking person that has that kind of behavior and you assign a lot of assumptions onto it that you just make based on your own opinion and your experience as a non-autistic person or a fully fluently speaking person, and you go, okay, well, like, those kinds of behaviors combined with the lack of ability to speak basically makes them a fundamentally different kind of person. Like what Ido Kedar mentioned, Dr. Lovas said that, or Lovas, I don't know how to pronounce it. He said that, like, autistic people, they have hair and they have faces and they have hands and they have bodies, but like in the physical sense they're human beings, but on the inside they're not. And this is eugenics, that the way that people look indicates that they are a fundamentally different kind of person. The evidence being a series of assumptions. And so you would think that, okay, if there are these people that do things like having very sudden, uncontrollable movements and vocalizations, and they can't do things like tie their shoes, they can't open and close a car door on their own, they can't do basic motor things, then why should it be expected of them that they would also have the motor capability to have one of the finest motor capabilities? Like I said, there are the vocal cords, it's the mandible, the tongue, the lips, the breath control. All of these different components come into, articulation and speech. So if these are people that have really significant motor control issues, then why would that not also be attributed to their lack of speech? This very clear motor function, differences combined with a normal, intact brain should indicate that, like, there has to be something else that's going on. It can't just be that they completely lack language. And so that's why I think, like I was talking about at the very end of my first video, that, like, the suggestion that non-speaking autistic people, like, somehow what's going on in their brains must be something similar to what happens to the development of children that are very neglected and abused. Like, that suggestion that somehow the cause could be the same, it's just like, it really just doesn't make very much sense. And I think it's really absurd that that's the best that psychology has to offer. That's the best explanation that they have to offer, is that maybe it kind of looks like something totally different, and maybe somehow they're kind of similar in some way, but we don't really know. And that's the basis that allows for ABA to exist. That is the basis by which RPM is not evidence-based, and that all of this systematic suppression of RPM can happen. That, like, this really vague idea without any real evidence or any real coherent theory, like, that's the whole basis of this, of, like, the discrimination of millions of people. The only way that these things can happen, the only way that RPM can continue to be suppressed in this way is by suppressing the information, is by, in a way, lying, lying by omission and coming to conclusions based on data that just doesn't show the things that they purport that it does, by making these really bad faith claims. I mean, it's like it all has to do with muddying the waters. And, it took me a really long time to really start to understand what is going on with RPM. Why is it that it's so suppressed? Why is it that it hasn't completely changed everything about autism? Is because it's like this really crazy system that has a ton of money behind, like, exploiting autistic children. It goes really deep and it's really complex, and it's why this video is so long, is because there isn't a short explanation, because there's so many different things that are involved. There's so much, like, smoke and mirrors that goes on, that it's really difficult to decipher what's happening for yourself, especially if you're a parent of a child with autism. You don't want to, of course you want to do anything to help your child, but if the internet and all of the professionals say that RPM is pseudo-scientific and it's not evidence-based and, it's unethical, then you're not going to want to take the risk of putting them in that situation. And I think a lot of the time where people that do put their children in RPM, it's like a word of mouth thing. It's like they see another parent who has a child that communicates via letterboard, and they see it with their own eyes, and then they go, oh my god, this is an option. That's why you have to watch the videos. That's why you have to see for yourself, because it's totally undeniable what happens. So I think we have to come back to, within this kind of incoherent theory in mainstream psychology, we have to come back to this question that I asked at the very end of my previous video of how can you determine who does have language and who does not have language on the autism spectrum? How can you determine who has language and who doesn't? It's not a question that you're ever going to find answered. It's not a question that can be answered because the premise is wrong. The whole premise of asking who doesn't have language is wrong, because we shouldn't be starting from there in the first place, of trying to prove that no, people do have language, non-speaking people do have language. Why are we starting from that point in the first place, when there is no evidence that leads to that suggestion other than a series of assumptions about people's outward appearance? I mean, there is no linguistic theory that's going to be able to explain, okay, these autistic people can acquire language, but these people can't. Because that's just not how it works. And I think we're going to be able to prove, hopefully sooner than later, that non-speaking people absolutely do have language, and that this whole idea that anyone can just be born without the capacity for language is very, 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 very wrong. So, of course, I had to, I couldn't get into the whole history of ABA and FC, and I couldn't go into, the amount of detail on everything that I wanted to get into. So I really encourage you to look at the resources that I'm going to have in the description. If you want to learn more about RPM, I think the best place to go, other than, watching videos and stuff, is to read Communication Alternatives in Autism. I mean, it's really enlightening. I encourage you to read the writing of Non-Speaking People. And so I want to give a really huge thank you to all the people whose writing I read, and to the people in the videos that I suggested that you watch. I wouldn't have been able to make this video without the autistic people that I talk about. So thank you for making it to the end of this video. I know this is a lot of information, and this video is super long, and so was my other video. So, you must have a really open mind and a deep desire for information. So I really appreciate you watching this. And before I wrap up, I just want to give a special thanks to a good friend of mine, Shahryar Hormozi, who helped me draw the automaton of the ABA prompting hierarchy. The first several times I drew that on my own, it was very bad. So I wouldn't have been able to do that without his help. And, once again, thank you to all of the autistic people that made this video happen. My name is Hope, and this has been the Dyslexic Linguist. I'll see you next time.